Welcome back to the Orthodox Ethos. I'm Father Peter Heers, and tonight we have a wonderful topic of interest to everyone across the board, Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Protestants, because it examines our common church history and especially the developments in the West. And we're going to be joined by the author, compiler of the new book from Uncut Mountain Press, The Errors of the Latins, in just one moment. We are very excited to have tonight the author of one of our newest books, The Errors of the Latins. And this is one of the best books we've ever published in terms of content, but also in terms of appearance. And we're going to start off just by introducing that to you all. And before we get into talking to the author and looking at the book in detail, we're going to go through quite a lot of at least give you a very good sense of what this book contains. But more importantly, we're going to talk about the heart of the whole effort that took over 10, 15 years of research. And it communicates to us the heart of the problem, the heart of our problem, our common problem in terms of holy tradition and life in Christ. But let's start by first just giving a general introduction to the book. And I want to bring on the stage here the Uncut Mountain Press website. And so all of you who have not or have gone, you recognize it. But if you've not, this is the book page. And here are the two volumes, The Errors of the Latins. And volume one here, which we're going to be spending most of our time on tonight, is, as it says here, the most extensive collection of text and veritable encyclopedia cataloging the points in which Catholicism departed or departs from traditional apostolic Christian beliefs and practices. And in particular, before we get into the five most important points that the author thinks we need to know about tonight, we're going to look at the pivotal 11th, 12th centuries, and we're going to be listening to one of the most important dogmatic theologians of the 20th century, and that is Yves Congar. So if you're a Roman Catholic and you have great love for Yves Congar, you're going to be treated to some wisdom that is extremely important to understand what happened. Why do we have a division? What happened in the time of the schism? Why do we have a departure, and a tragic departure from the first millennium church? Of course, it's all disputed, right? If you talk to an apologist for Catholicism, he'll say that the Orthodox innovated, were the first Protestants. We left the Pope. Collectively, all the patriarchs got together and said that we're no longer interested in being obedient. We're disobedient to the first see, the infallible see, the primatial see over all of Christendom. That's I guess one of the lines of apologetics for the Roman Catholics. And so is that the case? We're going to look at some basic facts of church history tonight, briefly before we go into the contents of the book. I think we've got to understand the context, historical and theological context, and then we'll understand which is addressed in part also in the book. But set it up, understand it properly. And so this collection here is going to walk us through that painstakingly with unbelievable amounts of bibliography references. I mean, it's unbelievable. It's unparalleled, I would say, to my knowledge, in the English language. And so you're going to have, as it says here, an ocean of texts which present the innovations and forgeries created, accepted, and defended by the Vatican and used to achieve and maintain dominance in its own sphere of influence. And it's going to be, I think, a standard text for anyone who's interested in the topic going forward. That's from the Uncut Mountain Press website. You can also, of course, look at volume 2, which is dealing almost exclusively with the forgeries and the inconsistencies, the contradictions, the innovations with regard to some major texts that were presented as legitimate, but were forgeries. Very important, pivotal texts in those days to maintain papal authority and power. And so that second volume is extremely important as well. But we're going to look mostly at the first volume tonight. And so before we do that, here's the volumes. For those of you who are just tuning in, never heard of this book, this is what we're talking about tonight. And I want to start off, welcome on the stage here, George, the author. He's not going to be on screen, but we're going to hear him. George, how you doing?
Hi, Father Peter. I'm doing great. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for joining us, and thank you for writing this 2-volume work, very important for the church today. And by the way, it's selling beyond anything we expected, because we, as a publisher, we know what people like, how many people like to buy different books, and there's a size that usually they like, and there's a price break they usually like, right? This book we did out of love for the sake of the truth, and we thought, well, eventually it'll probably pay itself off. Well, what are we, 2 months in? Not even 2 months in, and it's almost sold out. The first printing is almost gone. And so, to my great surprise, but also joy, that people are so interested in the truth of things. And I have to believe, George, that the vast majority of people buying this are either former Roman Catholics, or people considering Catholicism. In other words, very important book for them in their life. It's a life-changing decision for a lot of these people who are making, like we saw this morning. I don't know if you watched. We had a interview with the Cleave to Antiquity podcaster, who's now becoming Orthodox. He was a Protestant apologist and worked as a pastor for a number of years. He's converting to Orthodoxy. It's a huge life-changing decision on his part. So this book will lend and help many to make that decision in favor of the church that is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Before you want to give us just a few words about your whole journey and the struggle that you went through in putting this book together for us.
Sure. Yeah. The book's the fruit of many years of research. I mean, at this point, maybe almost 15 years total. And I'm a cradle Orthodox, but around college years, I was interested in the debate between Roman Catholicism and Orthodoxy, and just came across these traditionalist Roman Catholics who insisted, you have to be Roman Catholic for salvation. And the question just really was something that, troubled me, and I wanted to get to the heart of it. And so I read all the controversial works I could find, discussing the debates and the topics. And so, I mean, the book originally started out as just my personal notes. At one point I had a blog, and then I kind of organized them over the years, and eventually, it led up to this work, which I felt, contains some important references for people who want to look into this question.
I suppose your library must be massive now, and you got a whole, the majority of it is texts having to do with Catholicism, or at least your digital library.
Yes, I have collected a lot of books on the subject, and I mean, some are physical if I couldn't get them online, or I mean, the internet really helped. I mean, without that, this book wouldn't be possible, without digitization of books and people being able to email me.
I want to show people, the book just in, the physical book here. This is just one of the 2 volumes. Let me zoom in here. And so we're talking about, I think the first volume is 750 pages. That's dealing with doctrinal sacraments, these kind of issues, right? 750 pages. And then the second volume is 550 pages. And we're just to show you the quality of the production here, because I think we put a lot of love and care into this production. So it's one of the best books, if not the best book we've done today. And so that's a bit about the journey and the fruit of your work, which is helping people all over the place. Shall we jump in before, if you want to give me any other things you want to say before we jump into some of the slides that I prepared, before we get to your little presentation about the 5 or 10 most important points?
No, I think that's it.
Okay.
That's good.
All right. So let's jump into just some slides that we have from a previous presentation, which will help orient folks. And I'll put that on the screen here momentarily. From a previous live stream we did a couple of years ago. And so the first thing, let's see, try it again. There we go. Got a little lag here. All right. The first thing we want to talk about is the beginning. Like, how did it all begin, right? And why do we have a split? Why do we have Catholicism and the whole saga of the West over the last millennium? And many people date it to 1054. That's what for years, I thought, well, 1054 was the beginning. That's where even many Orthodox historians tend to say that's the beginning. They'll talk about these other dates, but they really say, no, that was the beginning. I understand that because it was a political, and dramatic break, but it already existed. It already existed for decades. And as we see here on this slide, in 1009, what are we about? From 879, Eighth Ecumenical Council to 1009, we're about 130 years. So 130 years after the very important Eighth Ecumenical Council in Constantinople, where the church was basically unified again, because there was a schism at the time between Constantinople and Rome. St. Photius the Great, of course, the great patriarch of Constantinople, at the head of that council. They come to agreements on a number of issues that were dividing them, including Bulgaria, other things, secondary things. But the main thing that remains historically is the rejection with an anathema of any addition to the creed. And of course, they had in mind the Filioque, which was the addition of the time, had gone on and spreading in the West. And they were supporting the Roman, not just the Roman in terms of Rome, the city, but the Roman See in Italy, the Roman See, in other words, having it still in the empire, dedicated to the Church of the Empire. They were supporting it against innovations and other political machinations in the West. And so Rome accepted the council, embraced the council, rejected any addition to the creed. Unfortunately, 130 years later, under the influence of other political minds in the North and West, they introduce again the Filioque, or for the first time in Rome ever, they introduced the Filioque into the Confession of Faith of Pope Sergius IV. And then 5 years later, they have it read at the coronation of Emperor Henry II in 1014. And in 1009, the Pope is removed from the diptychs. He's gone. He's no longer considered an Orthodox bishop by the patriarchs in the East, at least. And you can, if you know more details on these historical things, my understanding is Constantinople for sure removed him. Some make the claim that it was not removed in all the other sees. Do you know anything about that?
I'm actually not as familiar with that time period. Yeah.
The
specifics around that.
So at least in Constantinople, if not in other sees, he's removed and he's no longer considered rightly dividing the word of truth, because again, they had agreed with the Pope that there would be no additions to the creed, and they considered from St. Photius especially onward, but even in the council, of course, they considered it not the faith of the fathers, not the faith of the church. It was not accepted, it was rejected, it was considered heretical. And so in spite of all that, the Pope adds it, then he doubles down and he commemorates it. And then, of course, in 1054, we're 40 years later, they anathematize the Patriarch of Constantinople. And already the East is baptizing. They're complaining that the Orthodox in the East are baptizing converts or people coming over from certain parts of the West. I don't think it was universal. You talk about that in one of the first chapters we're going to talk about tonight, which is all about baptism. Very extensive, 70 pages you've dedicated to the question of proper Orthodox patristic understanding of baptism and especially the three immersions. And we'll talk about that shortly. But that's already at play from the get-go. And so that's where we start. And then what I want to do here is I want to jump to something that's going to become a theme tonight. And that is the question of, let's see. We're going to have to be a little patient. I'm going to get into these two slides here. We're going to go by those that have to do with the papacy. And we're going to jump to this slide here, which is a very important witness, contemporary witness, about what happened from 1075 to 1175, according to Yves Congar. Now, Yves Congar, for those of you who don't know, is one of the most important 20th century dogmatic theologians in the Roman Catholic Church. He is instrumental, if not, he is the father of the Vatican II ecclesiology. I studied him pretty extensively in my PhD thesis and wrote about his views. And so he's very well respected, if not revered in, serious. He did do a lot to bring back patristic texts in France. Spent a lot of time on going through those. But, we can go into him another time. But what's important here is, what does he say about this time period? What does he say? This is a witness from the West about this time period, which is you're going to see confirmed again and again and again in our 2-volume Errors of the Latins. It's very important. I don't think it's understood by a lot of people. And that alone, in my estimation, is enough. Like, you don't need to go into all the nitty-gritties of all these topics and all these innovations and forgeries, although it just further confirms again and again what happened. If you want to understand what happened, listen to what Yves Congar says, and then listen to what we're going to do chapter after chapter after chapter. And what is the theme? It's an amazing thing, points us to the truth of the Orthodox Church. So let me just read this here. This is from his section entitled Cultural Factors. By the way, you can find this free online at Orthodox or at Archives. Internet Archives has got this book free online. You can go and read it there. He says, a Christian of the 4th or 5th century would have felt less bewildered by the forms of piety current in the 11th century than would his counterpart of the 11th century in the forms of the 12th century. All right, so the 1100 is the key turning point, according to Congar. From 1075 to 1175, you have a total sea change in terms of the forms of piety changed drastically. The great break occurred in this transition period from the one to the other century. This change took place only in the West, where sometime between the end of the 11th and the end of the 12th century, everything was somehow transformed. This is not an Orthodox apologist talking. I can't stress this enough. This is one of the most important dogmatic theologians of the Orthodox Roman Catholic Church in the 20th century. Everything transformed. When did that happen? Just after the schism. This profound alteration of view did not take place in the East, where in some respects Christian matters are still today what they were then. You know, George, that one of the great, slogans of the apologists of Catholicism is, you guys are stuck in the first millennium. You guys are, what's the word? Petrified, right?
Yes. Yeah, I've heard them use the word stagnation, as like a bit of a derogatory term about how the Orthodox are unchanged. Although, when Roman Catholics talk with Protestants, they tend to focus on how Roman Catholicism is follows the Church Fathers and so on. But they take a different.
They want to prove continuity toward them, but they want to prove stagnation to us. So here, Yves Congar is saying, actually, they didn't change. They have pretty much the same for the last 2,000 years, and what they were in the West before the end of the 11th century. So he's very clearly saying 11th century, the West takes a total different turn. So let's go to, we're going to, I don't want to get bogged down here too much, but there's one or two more slides, and I want to just hear him out, and then we're going to jump into the book. All right. From a predominantly essential and exemplarist outlook to a naturalistic one. He's talking about the changes, the transitions, the transformations that happened. What happened? They went from an predominantly essential or exemplarist outlook, that's akin to what we understand the church should be, right? To a naturalistic one and an interest in existence. So this is a change in art form, a loss of Orthodox iconography is what he's pointing to. Number two, from a symbol to dialectic, from a synthetic perception to an inclination for analysis and questions. In other words, we have the beginning of scholasticism. You have a section here in your book, George, talking about scholasticism and how that is a major departure from the way we understood theology and theologism in the first millennium.
Yes.
Number 3, from a culture where tradition reigned and the habit of synthesis became ingrained to an academic milieu, right? Tradition reigned, synthesis became ingrained, a synthesis so important, right? And then you have now an academic milieu where continual questioning and research was the norm, and analysis the normal result of study. These followed the road of tradition, he says. And we have shown how one of the principal differences among the various peoples of the Orthodox faith is in fact that they are not trained, as are the Latins, by the schools. And we could talk about this in the question and answer if you want, but one of the things I pointed out in my thesis, and one of the things that we see in the 20th century, is that the great temptation that's coming from the West in our academic theology, where we have a lot of schools today in Orthodoxy, is exactly this. He's praising the Orthodox for their commitment to tradition, and the East knew no scholasticism of its own and was to experience rather neither the Reformation or the 16th, 18th century rationalism. One of the reasons why we didn't have those terrible developments that transformed and transfigured things in the West was because we were not slavishly committed to academic theology or the schools, but rather the monasteries were the center of the church always. And they were where we had the great theologians. And he says, finally, the East remained foreign to the 3 influences that shaped modern Catholicism. And then one last slide, which just drives it home even more. The West chooses rationalism over hesychism. Therefore, the West has evolved towards a type of analytical knowledge, which in some is rational. It needs to define the exact shape of things to see them independently, not synthesis, but independently of one another. In the first half of the 13th century, 1200 to 1250, a new kind of theological teaching and study appeared and established itself in the West, scholasticism. Until this time, the dominant type of teaching or study had been a contemplative or monastic nature, linked with the liturgical life of the abbeys, the monasteries, or the cathedrals. Now there was added a new type of teaching and study of an academic and rational nature, which was soon to take the place of the former. All right, so I think we've set the stage now. And let's go and let's look at the first volume. I have an electronic version. We'll put it on the screen, the table of contents that'll help people to follow along. And let me do that. Hang on one second. There we go. All right. Let me get this larger for everybody to see. All right. So this is the table of contents. And we're going to start out in the sacraments section. We're going to go as quickly through this as possible, George, because there's so much to cover in 1,300 pages, obviously. What I want to just touch on is this theme. We can go into all these rabbit trails, right? You've got endless references and endless amazing collection of texts here and excerpts. And by the way, one of the most important things you've done, I think, and I really appreciate that, is that you struggled to put large quotations so that no one would say you're taking things out of context. I think that's very important. That's why it ended up being 1,300 pages, right? One of the reasons.
Yeah, that was an important idea, that because I've kind of been burned myself reading books where the author would say, oh, okay, this church father says that, or the father said this, and then, rarely there would be a quote or there'd be a reference, and when you examine it, it doesn't quite say what is alleged. And I wanted to just present the information right before the readers of, when I make the point the church fathers say baptism is performed by 3 immersions in water, I simply quote all the fathers that I could find from the first 600 years that testify to that. So I would quote them at length. Maybe it isn't necessary. I could have summed up the chapter in a few sentences, but I just wanted to just prove before the audience, because this is, people can debate how important this is along with the other changes, but I wanted to document that this is the traditional mode of baptism. And of course, there's exceptions and extraordinary circumstances, but there's a standard that should be preserved, and we should keep following the standard. So that's the...
There you go. And you know what? If anybody who's got some objectivity and is open-minded, they're going to see just what an amazing achievement you have here. and it's going to be very hard to gainsay it and say, oh, this is just taken out of context, because there's, as you'll see, there's just an endless array of quotations and references. Now, with the question of baptism, we've spent a lot of time. We're very sensitive to the question of baptism. It's the foundation of the spiritual life. And it's we've doubled, tripled down in our work to say how important triple immersion is. And this is the patristic teaching. This is everywhere. And I want you to just give me a very quick introduction to this section for the listeners. And then I'm going to point out a few things, and then we're going to go on. So give me an introduction. What did you want to achieve here? What's the importance of this section in your book? Because you got 70 pages dedicated to this section.
I start out by quoting Thomas Aquinas in the Summa, where he says, quote, "Trine immersion is universally observed in baptism, and consequently anyone baptizing otherwise would sin gravely." That's what he says. I mean, he goes on to say, because that's what the church does. So, I mean, Roman Catholics might just say, well, the church can change these things. It's not essential, but still, this is an important admission.
And he's not writing that as a how he does in his back and forth. He gives the one thought, then another thought. Yes. But this is his position, right?
His conclusion, if I remember correctly. It's not an objection that he.
Yes. Okay, that's important to point out. So people might say, "Oh, that was just an objection. He didn't really mean that."
Right. I do quote him at length, and I do provide the Latin original, and he cites church fathers in support of that position, and. So
he seems to contradict himself, though, because I found works in my PhD thesis where he's justifying and saying, well, what it really means is a washing, and therefore it's not important if it's triple immersion. What's important is that there's a water, and if there's water, it's acceptable. So is he just did he have an evolution of thought, or is he just contradicting himself, or what's your thinking?
I'm not as familiar. I mean, he does say it's valid baptism to baptize otherwise, but he would say it's a sin because it's not following the ritual of the church. And this is in the middle of the 1200s. So this was, although even then there were many Roman Catholics who had been pouring or maybe immersing one time. And yeah, he says, I mean, yeah, I do quote him on whether immersion is necessary. And I mean, he says it can be done by other ways, but those are the exceptional cases.
He reminds me in some ways, from my research, Augustine played a role of fidelity to what came before him in many ways, but also a bridge to what would follow, because he was an original thinker. He was kind of on his own in North Africa in some ways, didn't know Greek. And so he was kind of paving his own way. And he ends up opening, in my estimation, doors to further development and ideas that are not patristic, even as he's trying to maintain the patristic ecclesiology. And Aquinas, in a similar way, does the same thing. It seems like he's straddling aspects of patristic tradition. He does, reference church fathers occasionally, but he's now in this time period where they're exalting the philosophers, and they want to reconcile everything with the philosophers. And so now he's saying, yes, but. And so maybe this is one of these times. It seems so crucial to me, his final take, which does open the door up to eventually the developments you saw in the West, where in Trent, later on you're going to quote that. In Trent, they innovate, they change, they talk about anybody can baptize. You can be a Muslim, a Jew, just as long as you do what the church intends and use water. So there's definitely a process here of disintegration or less, justification for departure. Would you agree with that?
Right. Yes. At Trent, they do admit that the early practice of the church was immersion. I quote the Trent Catechism, and they say it's a matter of indifference to the validity of the sacrament, whether it's performed once or thrice. It says, the faithful, however, will follow the practice of the particular church to which they belong. So there's already almost this opposite of Catholicity, which would be unity across the world. I mean, of course, there's always going to be some maybe differences across nations, but there's no need to have differences on the mode of baptism. This should be consistent. This was always considered the case. The exceptions were, maybe extreme cold weather, or if someone's in the desert with no sufficient water available. or someone's too weak to be lowered in, things like that, or on their deathbed.
Yeah, so economy, basically what we call economy, economia.
Yes.
Yeah. So you have a number of church fathers and writers here, and they're showing the universality of the need for triple immersion. Is that correct?
Yes, and more than that, we also have, which is important, a marker in time when the first people started deviating from immersion or triple immersion, and this the church fathers record that the Eunomians were the first to deviate from this. There was a heretical bishop named Eunomius. He was in the year 360 or so. He died around 395. It's mentioned that the Eunomians baptized not with triple immersion, but with one immersion only. And he's actually mentioned in the, I believe in the canons of the
Canon 7.
Second council. So it says,
First Constantinople Canon 7, very important, foundational, and of course Trullo of 95 just follows to the most part and adds to that. So yes, the Eunomian baptism, that's still a point of controversy among some. St. Nicodemus clearly says that here you see that what the fathers were interested in terms of presuppositions for economy was the form. Like there was no non-negotiable for them. You had to have the form for any kind of economia to be blessed. But there are contemporary academic theologians heavily influenced by the West, in my opinion, who say, no, that's not what they're talking about in Canon 7. They're talking about the theology, but that's not the case. As you show here, there was a universal teaching that said, no, we need to maintain fidelity to the form, to the triple immersion. And I especially went into the section of St. Basil here that you have, pretty extensive. And, there's so much here. I don't want to get into it, but there's so much great stuff to digest. Anybody who wants to go deeper here, it's really impressive. But I do want to say this. Let's go to page 62. I'm just going to quote it really quick. And St. Basil, of course, so important, right, to the ecumenical councils. His canons are essential if you want to understand the practice of the church in terms of both akrivia and economia. But he's saying in multiple places that triple immersion is, and he says it among other very important practices in the church that were given. He says, look, these things came down to us, basically word of mouth by the fathers in their practice and in the liturgical life. He says, if we were to attempt to reject such customs, in other words, keeping prayer to the east, and other very basic things that we did, the sign of the cross, the words of invocation, which you also talk about later, which they innovate on, and other things. If we were to reject these things as having no written authority, pay attention, all the Protestants out there, as having no written authority on the ground that the importance they possess is small, we should unintentionally injure the gospel in its very vitals. St. Basil the Great. Rather, we should make our public definition a mere phrase and nothing more. And then he goes on and explains this. So, he says elsewhere, I don't know if you have it in here or not, I didn't, but he says it's as if you have it incompletely or you have it not at all, it's the same loss. Somewhere he writes that. This is not a question. The Eunomian innovation certainly of doing one immersion is monumental. But unfortunately, didn't we see something similar in the West later on?
Yes. So there was some early deviation. And I tried to focus, I tried to limit my scope to just say, okay, this is what the church fathers say is the proper mode, and Roman Catholics no longer follow that. I mean, of course, there's a lot more to be said. I don't go into the question of heretical baptism, but I do mention things relating to that to show the church didn't accept the papacy. But we can get to that later.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. All right. Let's go on and stay with the theme that we're going to try to keep tonight, which is the question of of the when all these things happened, and they're almost always in the same time period. So now we go on to the question of the infant communion.
Yes.
And here you have infant communion given in the ancient church. When do we know when it started to change in the West?
There's different dates given, and it's rather surprising that, I mean, there was apparently a council in France around the year 800 that was the first to discourage giving communion to infants unless they're at the point of death. And I mean, but later on, infants at the point of death, even they were not given communion in the West. But most scholars say it was pretty general throughout the West for the first 1300 years. And this was something, and I quote, one rather startling matter, and you're highlighting there, the Council of Trent, they misrepresent the history of the practice. And I've confronted some Roman Catholics about it, and they say, well, ecumenical councils can be incorrect about, when they talk about history, they're infallible about dogma, because the Council of Trent falsely seems to make it seem that infant communion was not as widespread as it was. I quote other Roman Catholic scholars, even Pope, admitting that it was nearly universal. And this is huge, because this is probably the most important sacramental change, in my opinion, because it's a huge shame to not give the Holy Eucharist, Christ's body and blood, to children. And I don't see why. There's no real explanation given that's made sense to me. I mean, all they say is, "Oh, it's not necessary for salvation." That's all they say, and
it's not necessary for salvation. Isn't that amazing? How legalistic can we get, right? Because the Lord says just the opposite. If you do not eat my body and drink my blood, you have no life in you. But they what do they just rationalize it as well? Baptism is sufficient for salvation, or the minimum is sufficient, or how do you?
Yeah, what they'll say is, I mean, they'll give some. There's like an extreme case of a catechumen who was really sick and he wanted to become a Christian, and he was unconscious. This happened in the early church, and then the baptism he wanted was given to him on his deathbed, but he died before he could receive the Eucharist. And so he was asked by a saint was asked, "Oh, was this person in heaven or saved?" And he answered, "Yes, it was okay that we're not to say that he wasn't saved because he didn't receive."
So the exception, we have an exceptional case, but we make it the rule then on that basis.
Right. Yeah, it's a very edge case that shouldn't apply to say, oh, infants now shouldn't, or Eucharist is not necessary for salvation. They'll say baptism confers benefits, like the equivalent benefits of the Eucharist. That's how they'll explain it. They'll say baptism provides that participation in Christ's body and blood.
Now, on pages 86 and 87, you have two references to the Catholic Encyclopedia where they clearly say in the ancient church the practice was infant communion, and they cite, for instance, St. Cyprian and others, and they say it was fruitfully partaken. And you make the point, well, if it was fruitfully partaken, then it should be done. I mean, obviously, correct. There's good reason to have it.
Right. Yeah. He said it. Great. I mean, I really have trouble seeing how Roman Catholics justify this deviation. Yeah, it is beneficial for.
I think today they're rethinking it, but there's such inertia. It's an inertia question. I remember when I was looking at the liturgical texts around Vatican II, there were serious liturgical scholars in the 70s and 80s who were saying, look, even in the 60s, they were saying we need to get back to this, but they don't want to. It's like every innovation, or even my own sins. Do I want to really admit I made a mistake? It's difficult. The repentance part is hard. And if it's on an institutional level, and there might call into question the legitimacy or the authenticity or the authority of this institution, well, then you see it's very hard for institutions to make that turn. So I think that individual scholars will say, yeah, it's a no-brainer. But they don't want to make the sacrifice of their their authority. Basically, they're going to lose sight. They're going to lose face in front of millions and billions of people because they're going to admit they were wrong.
As a maybe slightly a funny note, I remember a debate I listened to a long time ago between an Orthodox priest and a Protestant apologist on the question of infant baptism. Should infants receive baptism? And at one point, the Protestant made the argument saying, "Oh, well, if you're consistent, all you're saying would apply to should having infants receiving communion as well." And the Protestant didn't know that the Orthodox give communion to infants, and the Orthodox priest replied, saying, "Well, we do provide infants communion." So
Absolutely.
I thought that was a little bit of a
So here in this section, use of leavened bread in the Eucharist. Of course, a very well-known dispute in the 11th century. At the time of the schism, it's mentioned in the anathema. I want to focus here on John O'Brien on page 95, who's a respected, very respected scholar. I believe I'm quoting him. He's an 1841 to 1879 American Roman Catholic priest and professor. Writes in the History of the Mass. He says, in this question of leavened or unleavened bread. Cardinal Bona tells us in his wonted modest way what a storm of indignation he brought down upon himself when he stated in his great work on the Mass and its ceremonies that the use of leavened and unleavened bread was common in the Latin Church until the beginning of the 10th century, when unleavened bread became obligatory. So we're talking about right at the schism. We should not go over the ground which the learned colonel did to prove his assertion, but simply say for the instruction of the reader that his opinion is embraced by almost all writers on sacred liturgy. So scholars here are saying there's no doubt that at the first use of that we're talking about 1050 as the first use of or the introduction that you must do unleavened. And this becomes a division point between Orthodoxy and the West.
yes. So I quote these Roman Catholics who admit that there was a change in the Western practice right at around the end of the first millennium, and the exact dates differs, and there's a lot of room for interpretation, and this whole leavened bread controversy can be kind of complicated to follow, but definitely the West changed their position on this at Rome, and so that was something. And moreover, they criticized the Orthodox for a position that they now allow the Uniates to have of using the leavened bread. When they definitely they almost condemn their own history in a way with.
So that's just another little brick in the wall of innovation around the time of the schism. It did not happen. For the most part, it says here that leavened bread was the general first use, then unleavened came in, and then unleavened became the standard about the time of the schism, which points again to this massive change that Yves Congar speaks about around the 11th to 12th centuries. Let's talk about the use of wafers really quickly. You have here in the notes and in the text that the first evidence is around 1050. That's just remarkable, right at the schism.
Yes, that's the Catholic Encyclopedia. Actually, I believe they admit that that the earliest evidence is at the time of the schism. It's from Cardinal Humbert, who was very antagonistic to the Patriarch of Constantinople, the Blessed Michael Cerularis. Yeah, it's a clear innovation. They didn't have that. It's listed as well in the 1848 encyclical of the Eastern Patriarchs.
By the way, I want to say it again. Required reading is this encyclical right here, the 1848 encyclical of the Patriarchs in response to the Pope, and the 1895 encyclical of the Patriarch at the time, I forget his name right now, to Pope Leo. And why not add the book that we published, the essay of Saint Raphael in response to that encyclical of the Pope in 1895. But those two encyclicals from the Patriarchs are very, very instructive. And it seems like you're using those as a kind of guide because you reference them quite often.
Exactly. That's the general framework. So I went through, you could consider these as the errors of the Latin. So I go through each of these items to have orthodox precedent from these authoritative documents, and I go through all these items that are mentioned and try and go in detail to show the Orthodox are correct in these questions, or at least hold the historical traditional view.
Wonderful. All right, so now we're looking at the elevation of the host. Tell us about that. Again, 12th century, close of the 12th century, 1100s, we have that new practice. What is that about?
Yeah, it's another innovation. Now, there's a lot of these to do with the liturgy and Eucharist. It's simply one of the liturgical rites, but it's admitted that it didn't exist until around the year 1200. Now, I mean, some of them, Roman Catholics would say, "Oh, this isn't too important," but I still go into it. I mean, the 1848 encyclical says considered it inappropriate, and it's so it's not an ancient rite. So I just give evidence to that effect. Yeah.
Okay, very good. Yeah, some of these things are less important, obviously, but they're indicative. That's what we want to get across. We want to show the reader how the spirit of innovation just overtook the West in about the same time, and they departed from practice and dogma. Of course, filioque was the dogma, and then eventually papal primacy, papal infallibility. But in many ways, you have all these innovations. So epiclesis, how do we say it in English? I'm thinking of epiclesis. Do we say that, or epiclesis?
I'm not sure myself.
It's a Greek word. So
yeah.
Anyway, again, you're citing the 1848 encyclical, and the Latins omit the invocation of the Holy Spirit, which was in all the old liturgies, both East and West, and now only the Eastern liturgies retain it. So again, what do we know more or less when this happened? You remember?
Let me see if I'll pull up my.
Yeah, I got it here as well. I mean, I noted a lot of stuff when I was reading through this, but that's one of the ones I didn't note exactly. If we have an exact date, because I don't know if we have an exact date for every single thing, right? So,
yes, I'm not sure the exact date on that, but I mean, it's definitely a first millennium. I mean, I see in the Catholic Encyclopedia say it's not until scholastic times that the theologians began to discuss these issues, and so kind of put some, raised some disputes on this. So that's another second millennium innovation, as far as I know, or maybe towards the end of the first.
Very good. Transubstantiation, a term that does not exist at all, or is now in much use in the West at this time.
This is a more technical change. It's more to say, I mean, the Orthodox accept of course, the full reality of the Eucharist, pretty much exactly as the Roman Catholics. There's just this difference of really the approach to it, the scholasticism. So yeah, the Orthodox do accept the word transubstantiation, but it's a scholastic novelty in its origination, and so it's more of a technicality here.
Okay. Interesting though, 1079 is apparently the first time we see this being used according to this Catholic Encyclopedia. Now, communion under both kinds is abandoned in the West, and what do you want to say about that? It sounds like it's also the 12th century. And here on page 112, it says, in the Catholic Encyclopedia, it must be stated that as a general fact that down to the 12th century in the West, as well as in the East, public communion in the churches was ordinarily administered and received under both kinds. All right, again, 12th century, we've got to change the practice.
Yes, and again, sometimes this century differs because there wasn't much consistency. Some places it changed at the 9th century, some places elsewhere, but I think the issue is when at Rome it changed as well. But yeah, the 1895 Orthodox encyclical does make this an important point. And the Protestants have also criticized Rome for this as well, for not giving Christ body and blood in both forms. And the Roman Catholic response is to say, well, Christ's body under the form of bread is sufficient because his body includes his blood. So they'll say these technicalities, which is maybe technically true, perhaps, but I don't go into that theology. I simply focus on, well, this is how communion was given. Christ says we should, do this and follow his commandments and follow the apostolic tradition. So this is a really huge one, and it's surprising that Roman Catholics simply admit this is a change. They think it's okay, and the Council of Trent actually makes one of the most remarkable claims. I mean, I don't know if many traditionalists know about this. I could quickly quote it. It's about the power of the church concerning the administration of the sacrament. It says, the church may determine or change whatever she may judge to be more expedient for the benefit of those who receive the sacraments, according to the variety of circumstances, times, and places. That's the Council of Trent in the 1500s. It's pretty much modernism almost in a way, saying the church can just change things according to circumstances, times, and places. I mean, I guess
It's one thing you could. It reminds me of the Apostle Paul. Like, everything's permitted, but not everything is profitable. So you can theoretically understand. Well, the church can do. In other words, God can do, if it's truly of God, economia. We would say, right? We can do economia, the thief on the cross, but it's profitable to do that without reason or without basis, or is it just becomes an innovation and on a legalistic basis? That's what needs to be examined. I mean, why? I think the question that everybody tonight should walk away with, that they should have to ask and answer, including of all of our Roman Catholic friends, some of them here who probably come here to try to defend their faith. Doesn't it strike you as at least odd that all of these innovations we're going to talk about tonight, almost all of them, are around the time of the schism or right after? And what do you do with the quote from Congar when it's collaborated not just by just one theologian, but by practice after practice after practice? So here again, with the question of the communion under both kinds, you have in 1415, in the Latin Council of Constance, right? You have the condemnation of maintaining communion under the forms of both bread and wine admits that the ancient practice was given communion under both species. So they're walking away from it even as they admit it, which is just, for an Orthodox conscience, it's startling to hear that.
I mean, yeah, it's really strange. Yeah, Constance. I can't believe what they say is. I mean, to me, it seems almost sacrilegious, where it says, although Christ instituted that venerable sacrament after supper and administrated it to his disciples under both species of bread and wine, yet notwithstanding this, and go on to say the church has determined that it should not be received that way.
Notwithstanding the words of the Lord.
And I put the Latin there in case someone might be tempted to doubt that. I believe the Latin is non obstante.
Are you on page 121? Where are you? Do you have the page number?
113 of that.
Okay, 113. Oh yeah, you have the entire Latin. Look at that. It's got 2 pages of Latin here.
Wow. They say
notwithstanding. How can they say that? Notwithstanding what Christ did. I mean, what is it? Who do they think that they are to say notwithstanding Christ's institution? They said this: the approved custom of the church maintains that they can.
This is the fundamental difference that people need to understand. The Orthodox have as their foundation, Epomenes tis Aegis Patrasi, following the Holy Fathers. Beginning of all the great documents of the ecumenical councils, it's the cornerstone of everything, including anyone today among the Orthodox who are not doing that are also in grave danger. We're not just talking about the Latins of the 12th century or the Protestants of the 16th. Anyone ever, heretics of all days and ages from the beginning, the Arians, the Monophysites, following the Holy Fathers. And the ancient heretics made a great effort to show that they were following the Holy Fathers, right? That was the great debate in the 4th, 5th century. What's strange about the Latins of the 12th and 13th century, they say we're not following the Holy Fathers. Forgive me for laughing, but it's startling. Like, no, in spite of what Christ says, in spite of what they did in the ancient church, we admit the ancient church did that, but we're going to do this.
Yeah,
it's not even like the ancient errors of the various groups. They're just saying no, we don't need to, which is so egregious from the Orthodox sensibilities.
Yes, yeah, and I mean that's. I mean, I tried to throughout the book I tried to consider what the Roman Catholic response would be to anticipate their thoughts and address already the to go deep into the debate, not just simply make a case like not hearing their position, but some of it is just the facts. I mean, all the Roman Catholics could say is this is not important. I mean, that's their only really response because the facts are there. They could just say, okay, these things can change. I mean, okay, to some degree, things can change over the centuries, and different nations have slightly different traditions in less important matters. But this is the Eucharist and the administering it in as how Christ wanted. So I don't think that's appropriate. And
Let's
that's
go
not
on.
me, it's the Father.
Yeah, right. Let's go on to chrismation and confirmation, which I actually know a few things about, but you did a quick but fantastic job here on page 127. Anybody who's got the book, you can follow along with us. 127, you're quoting an English Roman Catholic priest and professor writing the Catholic Encyclopedia, and he admits that the Western practice is deviated from the early church with regard to this sacrament. What do you want to say about it before I opine from my own research?
Yeah, super high level. It's mentioned in the 1848 encyclical, not anointing baptized infants as one of the Latin novelties. The Catechism of the Council of Trent says it's not fitting until they reach the age of reason. That's a scholastic, really, innovation, I believe, but the early church did give this sacrament to children, so they changed that sacrament, and that's the high level view.
It's interesting that the scholar says in the Greek church, this is Catholic Encyclopedia, in the Greek church and in Spain, infants are now, as in earlier times, confirmed immediately after baptism. In other words, chrismation, as we do. We've never separated, 2,000 years, we've never separated the three rites or sacraments of initiation: baptism, chrismation, communion, all three together to become an Orthodox Christian. And for my research, for my thesis, my PhD thesis, what was fascinating to me was to understand the development of doctrine. You had to understand the development of practice, because that usually was what happened. And then they dogmatized. And this is the scholars talking, not me. This is Lutheran and Catholic, Roman Catholic, modern 20th century scholars saying what happened was the practice changed, and it solidified, and this is all 12th, 13th centuries, right? And then the scholars came and said, why are we doing this? And then they theologized, in other words, speculative theology, and said, well, this is why we're doing it. And then they justified it. They justified it. They doubled down on it. And so they were cut off from the living tradition, which was unbroken in the East. This is the scholars talking. It never changed in the East. They cite it as in Vatican II to go back, post-Vatican II, committees and practices changing all their liturgical life, trying to get back to the ancient church, the best of them. And they say, well, we need to get back to the Eastern practices. They never changed. And so then you have a practical separation of the mysteries. So they would baptize, chrismate much later, first communion later, first confession later. Sometimes they would mess up the order. They'd have people communing before confessing. They'd have people communing before chrismation. And so you have this confusion and dissolution of the unity of the mysteries in practice. And then in Vatican II, you have the dissolution of the unity of the mysteries in terms of ecclesiology. So now you have an ecclesiology built on this practice, which is not the traditional Orthodox practice 2,000 years. And now we talk about people just being baptized as members of the body of Christ. Of course, now you can say, well, all of these Protestants and Orthodox are a part of the body of Christ because they're baptized. We recognize their baptism. Again, they dumb down the understanding of baptism. Anybody can do it, a Muslim, a Jew, an atheist, as long as they use water, not triple immersion, just water, and say the words. So now you have this very minimalistic definition of what a baptism is, right? Anybody can do it. Protestants can do it. Anybody, heretics can do it. Schismatics can do it. And just water, triple immerse. And everybody's baptized now. Millions, billions of people who are outside the Roman Catholic Church are baptized. And they're somehow, at Vatican II's ecclesiology, they're somehow a part of the church. They're incompletely in communion with the church. None of this makes any sense from the patristic standpoint. This never would have been possible if they had kept the unity of the mysteries in practice. They would never have considered, as we don't consider, somebody an Orthodox Christian if they're not communing, if they don't have chrismation. You see, you're like stillborn. You're stillborn. There's a problem here. You're half alive. You can't do that in the patristic understanding of the therapeutic program of the church. And so here, it's not a minor thing that they separate in time and space the baptism from the chrismation, which I don't think they understand why this is a problem. From my understanding, from my experience. So that's my 2 cents to double down on this. This is, you've got 2 pages on it. Oh, it's just a minor thing. It's not minor. It's extremely important in the whole development of doctrine in the West.
Right. Right. Yeah.
All right,
Bending
let's go.
degrees and
Let's go on.
idea.
We got so much to cover, and I talk too much, so let's keep going.
Okay.
Holy unction. What do you want to say about
Yeah.
holy unction here?
High level view. This isn't mentioned in the encyclicals, but it is talked about by other Orthodox theologians in the arguing against Roman Catholics. They changed the idea of holy unction. They call it extreme unction. The idea of the sacrament is it's from St. James says, if anyone is sick, you can have the priest go to them and perform the sacrament. But Roman Catholics change it to be really on someone's deathbed, and more than that, there's another mistake of the Council of Trent. I mean, this might be maybe sufficient to show the Council of Trent is an error, because it says they anathematize. They say, if anyone says that the rite and usage variance with the statement of the blessed Apostle James, and is therefore to be changed, and may without sin be despised by Christians, let him be anathema. So they anathematize this, but then Roman Catholics, I quote immediately after, the Catholic Encyclopedia admits that down to the 12th century, the Western practice was to give the unction freely to all who were suffering from serious illness, without waiting till danger of death was imminent. So I'm really surprised that, and I confronted a scholarly Roman Catholic about this, and he just said, well, at the time, at the Council of Trent, their theologians didn't have as good understanding of history as we did. But it seems to me that this is more than just an error of history, because they're anathematizing those who say that there was a change in the Latin tradition. So I think that alone might discredit the Roman Catholic Council.
Yeah, you're anathematizing something that was legitimate and it was practiced by your predecessors. That's a pretty egregious error. The next one in the list here is something that's back in the news to a certain degree. There was a kind of a debate, I think, recently by an Orthodox YouTube apologist and a Roman Catholic, and I think it was a traditionalist, and they were making the case that no, clerical celibacy is traditional, goes back to the apostles. And the Orthodox was, of course, defending some of the things that you have here. They were talking about. I didn't see the whole exchange, but for instance, they doubt this Paphnutius, and he was against mandatory celibacy. I think there's some doubt that's legitimate. I didn't hear then anybody, maybe I missed it, St. Patrick of Ireland, of course, very important, that he was a son of a deacon, who was a son of a priest, who was a son of a deacon.
Right.
So we got 3 generations of righteous men, right, who brought forth the righteous St. Patrick, and they were all married. That's a pretty significant historical witness to the Western practice of having married clergy.
Yes. So I do talk about that at length, and yeah, I mean, that sadly has led to a lot of issues for Roman Catholicism, some scandal. I try not to go over that too much, but I mean, at the time of the schism in 1054, the Roman Catholics made it seem like it is heresy to have married priests, and they committed themselves too far. Even the Pope said this, that it's a heretical view or impious view. So but they allow this to the Eastern Rite Roman Catholics, and that's one thing I do mention a couple times in the book, that all these criticisms that the Roman Catholics have made historically have applied against their own, later communions, when they tried to get the Orthodox to be under the papal authority. Yeah. So St. Patrick, we have Paphnutius. I go into. I know it's that. Story is questioned, but I give evidence. I do quote a pope who admits, actually a couple popes who admit that this happened, and I go over.
This is a very respected 19th century scholar, right? And he says that the church allowed married clergy.
Yeah, Hefele, he's maybe the top scholar of church councils. He's a German bishop and academic. He was against papal infallibility. By the way, I mean, later he accepted it, but he was one of those who brought up the case of Honorius against it. Yeah, I mean, we could talk for a while.
There's a lot of canons here, a lot of witnesses here. What's your last word on this? Because we, as I said, we've got 1,300 pages to cover. No, we're not going to cover everything.
There are some serious issues. I mean, many Roman Catholic priests still did have children, and I mean, you can find that in some of the books I cited. And then there's some even more troubling thing that, there was an apocryphal story that after it was found out that, I don't know, we don't need to really talk about, but the issue is very sad that there were priests who pressured their partners to commit abortions. It did happen. We have some records of that. It's, I mean,
Yeah, there's abuses of all this, but you're saying, well, when you have you make a doctrine or a dogmatic stance on something, which was never the case universally. The church didn't do this, didn't do it in council, and now you've made it a cornerstone practice and you've doubled down on it. Well, then it's relevant, the pastoral implications, right? Then these excesses and these distortions are not just a question of passion or worldliness. Yeah. You have now set yourself up to a certain degree to create these problems. And in the 20th century, you've had massive problems. Of course, they deny that it has anything to do with clerical celibacy, but it's hard. It's a hard case for them to make when there's so much bad fruit.
Yeah, exactly. I will say, the Council of Trullo settles the matter, Trullo, so that's it. It does say that priests should be married except for bishops. So, or not priests should be, but priests should be permitted to be married. So,
Council of Trullo, Canon 13.
Yeah, that's important. That's why I have a whole chapter just about Council of Trullo's authority, because Roman Catholics dispute that authority. So I have a whole chapter to defend Council of Trullo.
How different church history would have been if they had accepted the Council of Trullo, immediately and put it into practice in East and West, as it became, if I'm not mistaken, it became imperial law. Did it not?
Yes, it was accepted by the imperial law, the Council of Trullo.
Right. So why? I guess because they're outside the empire, they didn't feel the need to obey that. But I mean, it would have been a very different future if they had, because there were a number of things in Trullo that are really important for future Western development.
Right. Yeah, it is very important. I mean, there were just different authorities. They didn't have as much kind of maybe fidelity to those canons. They had their own, in some Latin jurisdictions, they did not follow that. So
let's talk about this. Divorce now, major issue. One of the big red herrings that are thrown out by Catholic apologists, Roman Catholic apologists, is, hey, you guys how can we accept you? You accept divorce, et cetera, et cetera. So this is something I know that Patrick Trulia is dealing with. I think he's going to have you on your show on his podcast soon. Right. And there are other Orthodox who are talking about this. And I just want to say that he's coming out with a book, if it's not already out. I think you might have heard about this, where it's is it the Acts of the Council of 930 something?
I heard about there's a Council 920 that has to do with fourth marriages. That's maybe an underlooked item. That's in one of the later chapters here. So I was intrigued when I found out.
So that's a council that was attended by legates from Rome before the schism, and is talking about the acceptability by extreme economy of a fourth marriage. Is that correct?
Yes. The legates did accept it afterwards. I guess there were no legates at the council, but 3 years later they came from Rome and did accept it. And it says the council said fourth marriage is not allowed. There can be up to three, but the Council of Florence.
Fourth marriage is not allowed. Fourth marriage is not allowed. Three are acceptable.
Yeah, and that's I was quite interested when I found out Craig is writing about this subject, so that I'm looking forward to finding out.
So Latins erroneously affirm the absolute indissolubility of marriage. In other words, they to this day, do they have this position, or do they now increasingly in practice put water in their wine with regard to adultery, or do they double down and say even for adultery there's no basis, scriptural or traditional basis for dissolution?
Right. Yeah, they do. I mean, for the current, I guess there's still a difference between the practice and the theoretical view. But yes, the theology is the bond of matrimony. I quote this: cannot be dissolved by reason of adultery on the part of one of the parties. That's a canon of Trent. So that's it's a dogma of faith for Roman Catholicism.
But it appears to contrast with what Christ says, except it be for fornication. That's an exception. And I didn't go too in depth into this. It seems to have taken a lot more importance. I noticed, like, on the maybe online discussions, this divorce question of Roman Catholics going on the offensive against Orthodoxy, but it didn't seem to be discussed too much historically. So it seems like one of those more modern objections that
Yes,
Catholics
yes,
have
yes.
against Orthodox, at least in terms of the importance. But I mentioned, as a counterpoint, Roman Catholics forced priests to separate from their wives right at the time of the schism, and it's almost like a forced separate. Although they would say it's not divorce, it's just a separation. But still, Christ says, um,
Do not separate that which has
yeah,
been united by
yeah,
God.
what
I
God
was
has.
impressed. I was impressed by Saint Cyril of Alexandria. Let me actually read the quote. Saint Cyril of Alexandria, in his commentary on Matthew 5:31 and 32, great church father, one of the greatest. It has been said, he's quoting scripture, whoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement, right? That's 5:31 to 32. A man's wise wife gives him another opportunity to let go of the marriage as the bond has not yet been dissolved. For it is not the papers of divorce that dissolve marriage, but before God, but evil behavior. So that is his commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, allowing for evil behavior. That doesn't even say particularly fornication, but is that what that maybe that's all he means, but doesn't say that.
Yeah, and there has been differences on what could constitute grounds for divorce. I mean, it can get. This is one of the most complicated topics, and to be honest, I haven't researched it as much. I just give a high level view because there's so many distinctions. I mean, the Roman Catholic theologians are very subtle and have lots of kind of intricacies where, I mean, even if something seems obvious on the surface, they somehow manage to split it up into many pieces. Like I mentioned, there's a pope who says who seems to allow for divorce, but Roman Catholics have just written a lot to explain it otherwise. So, like anyway, there's a 300-page doctoral dissertation just on the views of Pope Gregory II, who I quote. So, I mean, there's a lot of distinctions, but I do show that there were imperial laws that allowed for divorce, and no father of the church. Yes, that's the quote you're highlighting. No father of the church denounced those laws as contrary to Christianity, although they spoke so much against other errors of when emperors would do heretical things. So that was not something the fathers addressed like as an issue.
Maybe it's a point. It's also important to point out, at least to my knowledge. I'm not an expert either on this, but that the service of the second marriage is penitential. It's not the same service of the first. It's understood that this is a extreme economy, that people not be lost after the separation. Of course, when we're talking about separation for egregious reasons, for lack of fidelity, whatever, and people are divided and they're marrying again, but the church doesn't see it as a first marriage. There is a difference, and that points to the pastoral condescension of the church for people not to fall into fornication and into multiple partners and all the rest, which is increasingly, unbelievably becoming normal in today's society. You have a phenomenon of younger generations of having multiple partners, even though they're married. Of course, we're not talking about Orthodox Christians. I'm just saying that this is a problem in the pagan world, and the church was trying to curtail the destruction of the soul through the extreme fleshly lifestyle. And so there was a pastoral condescension. And their response to that, and at least in the last few hundred years, is the annulment solution, which is characteristic of a very legalistic mentality, right?
Oh yeah, you don't believe. It's almost funny these kind of legalistic tricks they would do. I read an article about this, how in Scotland it's almost like the prenup things, like very subtle legal ways that people can escape a marriage by, let's say, having someone be related to a baptismal sponsor of one of your children, and then you can say they were like too close, were too close related. The marriage was never valid to begin with. People would set up all sorts of like
weird, sneaky things like that to get out of. Um, and I can't remember off the top of my head what they did, but these sorts of subtle ways that they could always say this was never a valid marriage. Just there's all sorts of ways someone could set it up so they could get
Right.
out
Right.
in advance.
Right.
Just maybe like
you also have different positions of different popes, one after another. But we're going to move on
sure.
In different topics. We're going to move on. We're going to skip a couple of things. I just want to commemorate them here. Marriage with prohibited degrees. That's a whole question that you go into. We're not going to talk about that tonight. Fourth or more marriages. What was the
that's the Council of 920. That's the one where
yes,
yeah, that Craig's writing about. Yeah, basic view is
fourth marriage
are not allowed. And
right.
I mean, again, it's strange. Roman Catholics would say, "Oh, Orthodox allow this," but we're more strict. They're not as strict on at this point. They say it could be no limit, and it is strange that Roman Catholics say, "Okay, after someone dies," like I still struggle. What's the distinction with saying, "Oh, after someone dies, it's okay to marry somebody else"? Why is that not okay while they're still alive? With the whole divorce thing. What does it matter if they're alive or dead? Because we're all alive in Christ anyway. Anyway, we could move forward.
All right, and then you do deal with the question of confession, which is more of a development and mentality, holy orders, and we have innovations with regard to the matter and form of ordination, and then we get into the theological. Jump in if you want to. You really want to say something. I'm just trying to get to some of the further down the road here. I want to get to some of those that make the point of the departure in the 12th century. Yes. But is there anything you want to say here? Go ahead.
No, I think we're good. Yeah, that again, just that table of contents is sufficient. That's another change. It's more of a sort of process of how this, the holy orders happened.
Okay.
Admitted, this is all the Catholic Encyclopedia. This is a conservative publication from the early 1900s that the Pope approved of, and he even signed the copies of the Catholic Encyclopedia. So it's like a authoritative document.
Yes. So this whole section here, part 2, theological innovations, we're talking about, first and foremost, the Filioque, of course, the famous Filioque. Very extensive. You have the overview of and Leo III's judgment, different creeds, and the Council of Trent. We have section 3, the early councils on the creed. Section 4, theological problems of the Filioque. Section 5, classical works on the Filioque. Section 6, notes on St. Photios' life and work, so important for the Orthodox teaching. And of course, St. Gregory Palamas follows him and writes a phenomenal examination of the procession of the Holy Spirit, which we published here at Uncut Mountain Press, and the Great Schism of 1054. And we're not going to talk a lot about that because it's talked about quite a bit. And
it's a huge subject, yes.
It's a huge subject. And I want to get to this a little further down the road here to some of these other things that are lesser known, right? Because they make a point here. So the original sin, well known. We have a number of books that are quite extensive on that. Romanides' famous book on ancestral sin, which is a pathfinder book in many ways, controversial, but nonetheless. So I want to stop here at, let me see. Yeah, interesting. I haven't read this section. I wish I had time. Very important. Probably you just touch at a high level, the Latin doctrine of salvation. Do you want to talk anything about that?
It's more of a theological view. You can see some changes definitely right at the turn of the second millennium by Anselm of Canterbury. He was a big one to just change some ideas. So, but yeah, we could just move.
Okay. Now, with regard to purgatory, we have a clear novel dogma, as you commemorate here. What do we know? Do we know more or less when that's introduced?
It is sometimes tough to really assign a date because some things are almost a vague idea, and Protestants reject the idea of prayer for the dead, and Roman Catholics argue from prayer of the dead to purgatory, but I still, of course, there's a huge topic at the Council of Florence. Let me check my notes. I have a good quote. I'm going to see if I can find it real quick.
Well, it certainly is not discussed before, to my knowledge, in terms of any developed dogmatic stance on the part of the West until Florence, right? It doesn't become an issue until much later. So it's got to be post schism.
Okay, yeah, I have it. Yeah, I quote the French medieval historian Jacques Le Goff. He lived 1924 to 2014. I don't think he was Roman Catholic, but he says in the second half of the 12th century, the idea of purgatory finally took hold in the
There you
West.
go. Once again, we've got the 12th century as the date for the innovation. The papal treasury of merit kind of goes along with this doctrine, doesn't it?
Yeah, and again, yeah, high level view. I mean, this is one of the most clear novelties. It was simply a theological speculation. You can almost date it exactly to the decade around. If I remember the 1240s. It was first proposed by scholastics, and then the Pope made it an official dogma in 1343. So it's such a novelty. Okay, yeah. So it dates to the 1230s, and then it barely has a century of antiquity to become a doctrine of the faith.
Wow.
Yes, yeah, as you're highlighting. So it's just this idea. It says Christ. Only one only one drop of Christ's blood would have been needed to save all of humanity, and now with all the extra blood, this sort of superfluous amount the Pope can use as a treasury to dispense and grant blessings with it.
They've never formally rejected that, though, have they? Have they ever formally rejected that? To my knowledge, they have not.
No, I believe it's still the dogma. Maybe there's different nuances they'll put on that, and maybe I'm presenting it in a more harsher light. But that's
isn't it amazing? Isn't it amazing? After your research, I want you to tell me your thoughts on this. 20th century, 21st century, we have our compromisers and ecumenists in our midst in the Orthodox Church who are rushing to embrace, as the famous book said, and all they ever talk about is dividing us is infallibility and primacy, right? That's all it ever. I mean, that's a talking point. That's a talking point. And what are we going to do? Let's just say we figure it out. We got a document. It comes out next month. We're gonna divide the church up. We're gonna have a pope in the east, pope in the west, whatever their solution, right? What do you do with all this? What do you do with all these innovations? What do you do with the papal treasury of merit? What do you do with this, which is absolutely repugnant to patristic theology and inconsistent? You, as a scholar, now sat there for 14 years poring over this text. How would you deal with it? What would you say to that?
To be honest, I don't know. I mean, I try to be charitable. It would have been easier to have a reconciliation at the end of the 11th century than now. Maybe. I mean, now that the feelings are more ecumenistic. There's more like people are interacting with each other in more friendly terms. But at the end of the 11th century, it was just the question of the filioque in the creed. Peter of Antioch famously said that if the Roman Catholics or if the Pope could simply remove the filioque from the creed, that's all I would ask. Like he'd say he'd be okay with the other issues with baptism and all this, as long as they remove the filioque from the creed. But they didn't since then, and there's only been more and more changes, and so
yes.
Yeah, there was.
Yes,
I
absolutely.
Don't know how to reconcile the other questions.
I mean, you have indulgences here. Again, when did this come up? About the same time, I would think, right? 1476. You've got 1476 here.
The
Pope
first time
64th.
they're applied to souls in purgatory, and indulgences are a clear novelty. They're not found in the Church Fathers. It's, they'll stretch certain. They'll say maybe economia is a form of indulgences, but they kind of misrepresent it. At the chapter, I quote Luke 6:20, where Christ says, "Blessed be ye poor, for yours is the kingdom of God." It's a little bit of a dig at how indulgences were sold. Roman Catholics have been at pains to sort of explain how this doesn't favor the rich, by selling indulgences. And I do mention in a footnote the Orthodox, maybe perhaps similarity of the absolution certificates, which are completely different theologically speaking and have a different context. So it is I just go over how it's a novelty. Maybe around the year, I don't know, it's tough to assign a year, but it is. You can see that their novelty. And I quote
Well, see, you've got an Anglican clergyman, James Brogden, who writes, it's probably indeed that Gregory the Sixth, commonly known as by his former name Hildebrand, was the first that granted any indulgences, and that was above 1,000 years after Christ. Yeah. Cardinal Tollet says that Pascal II was the first that granted indulgences for the dead, and that was about 1100. And then the first that granted plenary indulgences was Pope Boniface VIII, who lived about the year 1300. So ancient is this new Catholic faith. This is an Anglican who's criticizing it.
Yeah.
So again, fascinating to me. Everything is about the time of the schism. You've got these innovations that are happening just after the introduction of the filioque. Here we have the full reward for the just before the just last judgment. Tell us about that? I don't think anybody even knows about that.
Yeah, it's a more obscure topic. I mean, I just give a brief overview since it's mentioned in the 1895 encyclical. I just say it's made a doctrine of faith in the year 1336, and before then it was disputed or debated, and it's one of the more complicated theological positions. But I mean, yeah, you can date that definition of faith. I mean, it doesn't seem to have much antiquity in the first millennium, to my knowledge.
And then you have this. Unfortunately, you have this terrible theologian in here, Peter Heers. What are you doing quoting people like this? I can't believe I made it into the book. Far more important people around me. Anyway, we just quote the fathers, so that's why you thought, oh, this is an easy quote to put in because it's got a bunch of church fathers, and that makes sense. But essence, energy, distinction, I'm not going to talk about this because it's all over the place. Jay Dyers talks about it continually. Everybody knows about it. It's a major thing. Scholasticism, also pretty well known. This was a system really unknown, the methodology, the theological methodology, the academic approach to theology. We talked about that earlier with Congar, who said this is a total change after the schism,
right? And
easily, rejected by Orthodox Orthodox texts and teachers. So I want to jump down a bit and just show you on the screen because I want to get to your 5 points because we're getting bogged down here. But let me move on to a few more that I thought were very interesting that people don't know about. I want to get to things that people just have no clue about, right? So you have, of course, the fasting on Saturday was an issue, the Gregorian date of Easter, Pascha. You have the musical instruments in the church. Orthodox still do not use musical instruments in the church. That was introduced. And the Council of Trent accepts instruments in the churches.
Yeah, I mean, I've been to some Orthodox churches that have an organ, and apparently that practice started maybe around the year 1900 in Orthodox churches, mainly in America. I think because they purchased some church buildings from maybe Protestants or Roman Catholics, but and I've had criticism about this chapter and other things saying, oh, well, Orthodox do this too. But the whole idea is the context of the antiquity, that Roman Catholicism was much more willing to accept innovations, and
I would argue that we're doing that because we're in the West, because we're surrounded by heterodoxy, and it's a secularization. Whereas this was done within councils. Councils embraced it. It's a very different level of authority. I mean, I don't think there's any conciliar patristic teaching that let's have instruments in the churches. It's just the opposite.
Yeah, the fathers say the human voice is the greatest musical instrument. So that's what we should use. God made our voice.
I always wondered, because I know there are people who say the sign of the cross is not a big deal, blah, blah, blah. But you're saying that actually the sign of the cross used to be made in the West as well in the Orthodox manner. Is that correct?
Yes, I do quote the Catholic Encyclopedia admitting that, and then it's almost hard to find records like that specify exactly this, but there are some. We have some records there's one from the York Missal from England. It says it should be right shoulder, then the left shoulder. And this is one of the theories as to how it switched is because sometimes when the priest makes a sign of the cross over the people, it's done in the reverse way. It's from left to right, so that facing the people, it's from right to left. So this may have been one of the reasons.
Yeah, not a big deal, but it again just points to the spirit of innovation. How about
Yeah.
this is actually really important. People don't realize these things are important. The whole question of canonization. I've been talking about this for a long time in the last year or two, because there's a great danger that we are going to get sucked into the mentality that's been prevalent in the West, that the bishops tell us who the saints are. In other words, it's a top-down decision. It's not. It never was. Never been in an Orthodox church. And as you point out here, not until 993 do we have any solemn papal canonization. And I'm pretty sure much later in the East do we have any solemn canonizations that we have, very common in the last couple hundred years. In other words, the church organically, locally, among the people and God's witness through miracles, incorporated the saints into the liturgical life, and celebrated their memory and painted icons without it being a top-down decision-making process.
So I do go over that. It did become a lot more formalized. I think you can trace the papal authority in this, because there were some, I quote the Catholic Encyclopedia just restricting the authority of bishops to recognize who was a saint. In fact, let me see if I can find.
Again, toward the end of the 11th century.
Yeah.
Papal restriction on people only. So again, this is the total innovation here, again and again and again.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
Catholic Encyclopedia. That's actually a quote from Catholic Encyclopedia. Towards the close of the 11th century, the popes found it necessary to restrict episcopal authority on this point. That's the Catholic Encyclopedia admitting that. End of 11th century, so right after the schism.
Again, not that huge of an issue, but again, indicative. You've got this question of the. Let's see, where are we?
I could briefly go over this. I don't want to.
Briefly, because I want to get to your points here. But you've got 1047. The term is coming up. I mean, it makes sense. This is the time of the Gregorian reforms and this massive injection of power and authority into the papacy.
Is literally the word papacy didn't exist until the year 1047. Like the word papacy, I looked into it, I couldn't find an earlier use of the word papatus.
Interesting.
Fascinating.
And then you have 11th century for this, exemptions and dispensations, this whole idea. What do you, just really quick, just give us a definition of that.
Yeah, pretty much it's summarized there in the table of contents. You can see it just allows different kind of changes in authority in a diocese as to changing things. And they wanted to give monks, basically monks ended up being able to avoid their authority of their bishop and go to the Pope, and they could so it caused a lot of issues in Roman Catholicism, because it had all these. It just caused a disorder because bishops couldn't have control over the monasteries, and then there was
diocesan affairs there, as you say here. Interesting. Papal encyclicals also from this time period. I'm assuming this development.
And so this is a very minor issue, but it's still something that we can see. It's just the usage of encyclical. It almost implies that someone has authority. This was commonly issued back in the past by patriarchs. They would issue encyclicals, but now it's only the Pope. And I quote the Catholic Encyclopedia on that as well.
Elections. The mode of electing shortly changed after the schism.
Oh, that's a rather significant one. I mean, I love what Overbeck, how he puts it. Overbeck, he says, scarcely the schism was accomplished when Pope Nicholas II in the year 1059 deprived the clergy and people of Rome of the right to elect their bishop, and without any ceremony conferred it on the College of Cardinals. So this is shortly after the schism. They just changed how a pope is elected and give cardinals.
So no sense of following the Holy Fathers. What have we done for 1,000 years? No need. Let's just change things up.
And maybe on its own, it's not too important. It's an administrative thing, but it's still rather notable that this happened right after. I mean, I know the 1054 date is disputed, but that's, I think, a good reference. It's a good.
It goes deeper at 1054, right? It becomes really pronounced. Papal interdict's a sharp discontinuity from tradition. What is a papal interdict for our laymen?
It's basically saying the Pope can, if he doesn't like what maybe the leader of a territory is doing, they can just ban all sacraments in a region. And they did this in the past when they had issues because when the Pope was a temporal prince, he was a secular prince, and in the Papal States, and they put it on the Kingdom of England. Sometimes, let's say to basically get the people to rise up against their king or protest. They would just say no sacraments are allowed except for deathbed confession and baptism. They wouldn't allow the Eucharist or anything because they had a dispute with maybe some problem that happened.
Wow. So another just aggrandizement of papal power. Jubilees, persons dated in AD 1300. I've always wondered, what are these jubilees all about? We hear this all the time. We have a jubilee. We've never done this. What is?
I guess this is a year of jubilee, so 2025. So originally it was for 100 years. And by Boniface VIII, he appealed to tradition, but there isn't much that can be found. But then they kept it. It's where basically there's a big sort of celebration in Rome and they kept increasing the frequencies, and Protestants said this was because it proved very lucrative financially for Rome. So first it was only every 100 years, but then they changed it to every 50 years, then every 33, and then 25, which it has been the rule since to now. The origin is from the Bible, and where there was trying to remember, in the Old Testament there was a
yes. Now as you say that, yes.
Oh, that's canceled every 50 years. But anyway. We could go.
Oath of fealty and allegiance to the Pope by bishops at their consecration. Yeah, that's from the 11th century by Pope Gregory VII.
Again, you can date this in the year 1079. Gregory VII, who did so much to expand the power of the papacy. He pressured priests to be a celibate. He basically there was this oath that bishops take, not just to obey the Pope in canonical matters, but to have fealty as if they were a direct lord, in the feudal system. So it was a more than just a sort of religious duty; it was a kind of allegiance in secular matters too.
Dependence of the bishops, confirmation of bishops from the papacy. You've got the crossier and the pastoral staff. You've got the episcopal rings. These are all things. Clerical beards. That was fascinating. When was the first beardless pope? It was actually it was 200 or 300 years before the schism, but then it becomes a major issue of accusation, I guess, against the Latins by the Orthodox, saying, what is this innovation that the priests don't have beards? And so for the first millennium, they mostly had beards in the West.
Yes, that's my understanding, mostly in the first millennium, although there's a lot of exceptions. It is a little difficult, to be honest, and there's a traditional difference from the ancient, cultures from Greek and Latin, but yeah, the Church Fathers do say beards is a sign of manliness, and this is appropriate for. They'll say even for all people, not just
clergy. for all men. Yeah,
but we have a lot of priests who don't have beards, so it's not my business. I'm not criticizing any priest or anything.
It's a historical question. It's an historical question. Yeah. It's a question. Again, it's relevant because we're looking at this trend of innovation, change, distortion,
right?
And basically, a totally new kind of thinking about Christian tradition, Christian history. Right. And here you have military and secular bishops. Wow. Yeah. What's
that was about? Another issue. Even Roman Catholics admit this. The abuse really in the 1000s, where Latin bishops would go forth to battles, stain their hands with blood, killing other people, and then celebrating the liturgy, which you shouldn't be doing. If you kill a human, you should not be celebrating the liturgy afterwards. And that was something that there was an issue. Of course, there's a question of can clergy have temporal power? Can they be involved in the military? So I go into that. There are a lot of exceptions, but there definitely was an abuse here in the Latin West on that.
Now, this is extremely important to me. I've done a lot of work on this. Actually, in my presentation, I talk about the stigmata. To me, it's a huge sign of a now 200-year, right? We have a 200-year departure. Never occurred in the history of the church before Francis of Assisi. First time recorded, unknown. That was my research. That's what I found. 1224, Francis of Assisi. And since then, there's been at least 321 stigmatics only in Catholicism. So we're talking about a massive departure from the first millennium in terms of the spiritual life. We could talk for an hours about the stigmata, fascinating thing, right? But I just want to say, if you're Roman Catholic and you're looking at this tonight, doesn't that kind of strike you as odd? How do you justify that? How does it make any sense to you? Why would we not have any sign of the stigmata for 1,224 years? And all of a sudden it starts and you've got 321 of them only in Catholicism, right? We've never had anything like it in Orthodoxy.
Yeah, there's been not in Orthodoxy as far as I know, but there's strangely been cases of stigmata in other maybe heretical Christian sects and even outside the Christian profession, like in some Buddhist groups. It's weird. I don't know, but it's just not
non-Christian. It's a non-Christian phenomenon as well, because I don't think Protestants have anything like that, do they?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I found some cases that were, I can't remember now, but people claiming to be Christian, but part of some sects, maybe Protestant. I don't remember now, but I did come across that. The main point is this never happened in the church until this Roman Catholic Saint Francis of Assisi in the year 1224. So yeah. And,
wow. Yeah, and we have an analysis of this from an Orthodox perspective by a scholar, and Father Seraphim Rose mentions it. And really, at least those who've written about it from the Orthodox perspective think it's delusional. Do not see it as a sign. Well, and mainly because he's asking for it. And Father Seraphim Rose writes that this would be if this had happened in an Orthodox monastery, let's say, the abbot would have said, "You're delusional. Why would you ask for that? That's not something that God did that once. Christ did that once on the cross. He died for us. You don't ask for that kind of imitation. The imitation is to acquire the virtues. Only Christ and his crucifixion, it's not repeatable. And so the whole idea that you would ask for it alone, whether you receive it or not, I think would be rejected. I've spent, a lot of time in Mount Athos. I don't think any of the fathers today in Athos would say, yeah, go ask for that gift. No, yeah. Would never happen.
For sure. And with that idea of the interpretation of the church fathers that, Roman Catholics say we should follow the consensus of the church fathers. None of them interpreted St. Paul's words, "I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Jesus." No one interpreted that in favor of the stigmata. Because literally in the Latin Vulgate, the word marks is stigmata. But, this is another case of them not being.
This is freaky. I've never heard of this. What is this about? Visions or stories of Latins receiving milk from Mary's breasts.
Yeah, you can see some rather, it is disturbing to me and some other people, and it's said to be a bit of a, maybe perhaps it
just happens to be the 12th century again.
Yeah, no one, basically the first was, I believe, Roman Catholic Saint Bernard of Clairvaux in the year 1090 to 1153. That's when he lived.
Wow.
Yeah, allegedly. There's only Christ. It's a strange thing to tell. Only Christ received milk from the Blessed.
Yeah, here we go again.
Almost blasphemy to say someone else did as well. So I don't like. Yeah, I could not find any other examples before the 12th century.
Yeah. There's a lot of, I don't know if you got into this, the spirituality of medieval Roman Catholic saints, where there's a lot of sensuality. There's a lot of talk of romance. It's shocking for an Orthodox sensibility to hear that. Obviously this prayer, as you say, theologically, the Hail Mary prayer is not a problem, but it is interesting that you don't hear about it before the 11th century.
Yeah. So
again.
Yeah, that's basically it. I just had a page and a half on that. Basically Catholic encyclopedia.
Again, changes in monasticism, again, in that time period.
Yeah,
iconography. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Iconography. Yeah, that's a really high level. There's been an excessive amount of nudity in
art in the Roman Catholic churches, and that was probably one of the main issue. And yeah, and I go in depth onto the central gates to St. Peter's Basilica. It's full of like maybe the worst of the Renaissance traditions. I mean, honestly, strange that they depict some quite inappropriate things. You can look
Devotion to the Sacred Hearts of Jesus and Mary. Again, something that most Orthodox, if not, I've never heard any Orthodox say, yeah, this is a good idea, unless you're maybe a Western Rite and you're confused. But no, there is no such thing in Orthodoxy. And again, for the first millennium in the West, there was nothing. We don't have any particular dates, but I think it's certainly after the 12th century.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wonder if
theologically, I give a reference to someone who talks about it. I don't talk about the theological implications, but just I simply quote the Catholic Encyclopedia, admitting this was in the 11th and 12th centuries that we find the first indications
there you
of
go.
devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus and Mary. Like it's a specific physical body part they have devotion to, which I don't think there's precedent in the early church for just adoring a specific physical body part. It seems a bit theologically erroneous.
Right. All right, we're going to cut it off there because I want to get to your final presentation because we're already way late. So let's go to that, and let me put it on the screen, and you just walk us through it. And let me get it up there. Hang on one second, and share the screen. And so we're going to probably be a little repetitive, but that's all right. It's kind of like a summary. We'll have like a bit of a summary here. Let me get rid of this as well. The banner doesn't need to be there. And I'll get a little bigger if I can. And well, probably can't. So let's go quickly. You go ahead and just walk us through it.
Yeah, a lot of these we went over. Yeah, Filioque in the Creed. I quote perhaps the most important authority, Pope Leo III. He said the makers of the Creed forbade the Filioque to be added afterwards. I mean, this is the most important testimony. And we didn't have any. I mean, Roman Catholics just simply. I don't. Their responses is simply just to say, "Oh well, Leo believed in the Filioque. It's just a technical thing," but no. And then the Catholic Encyclopedia. You kind of touched base on this earlier with, Benedict VIII. You mentioned an earlier pope in the year I think 1009. So I'm not sure on the exact dates on that, but. We could probably go over to the next slide. And this is another point. The Filioque, it's inconsistent. They're supposed to be Catholic, but they do allow chanting a creed with and without the Filioque. So it's not consistent. And I quote Pope Nicholas III saying there should not be diversity in the creed because of the unity of faith. So it's I think that's notable that they don't do that. Mandatory clerical celibacy is an issue. It did cause a lot of social damage to Europe, and because many priests did have a partner, especially in Germany, and it just wasn't official. It's not a good state of society to allow that. And they called priestly marriage heresy. They've been inconsistent, allowing married clergy. I quote Paphnutius. They forcibly separated priests from their wives. Sad scandals. We could go past that. Infant communion, that was unanimous. Scholasticism developed that age of reason idea. They said it's just a simple rite and custom. I quote a pope saying that this is a simple rite and custom to give the Eucharist to infants. So, but it's far more than that. Chrismation, we went over this. And again, this is Roman Catholics say this: we should interpret the scriptures according to the unanimous consent of the Church Fathers. So I'm trying to present that the early Church Fathers saw everything they did. This is how they saw the scripture as implying this. So we should be following those practices. I mean, some things can change, sure, but not the fact that we give communion to infants. Okay, so we could go to the next slide. Holy unction. We went over this, 12th and 13th century change of not giving unction to the sick, just to the dying. And this is what we mentioned earlier. Papal infallibility, we didn't talk about. I think I do a good presentation in the book on this question just by focusing on two strong cases, or a few more than that. But St. Cyprian's controversy with Pope St. Stephen, you should just read the text. The early church did not hold to the theory of the papacy. as defined by Vatican I, and the secular power. I mean, that's a whole nother question, which is rather surprising that they made it seem that Christ left to Peter not only the whole church but also the whole world to govern. That's at the height of the papal power under Innocent III.
Yeah, that section is almost 400 pages, so it's almost half or about half of the book. So, we haven't even got half of the book, and that's just half of one of the books. So you can see just how extensive your presentation is. It doesn't leave any stone unturned. All right, we talked about this a minute. Let's go to this.
I think we're good. So I say next to Filioque, perhaps the most serious issue. This is a high level view. We also look at how St. Augustine comments on the whole controversy with Cyprian and Pope Stephen. I know the question is heretical baptism, but I look at for what is the source of authority. St. Augustine says it's church councils, not the Pope at Rome. So that's
very important.
Key.
Yeah, very important. Very important.
And then these three things I've tried to go as in depth as possible, because when I was doing my research, everyone talks about how important Canon 28 is. So I want to go follow all the back and forth and go as deep into these questions as possible. And so I addressed all those issues. Canon 28 basically says that Constantinople has equal privileges with Rome and is second after Rome. So this would, by implication, take away the idea that Rome is supreme over the rest of the church, because otherwise Constantinople couldn't have equal privileges over it.
Yes.
Council of Trullo, it reinforces that Canon 28, so that's why it's a reiteration. It's part of the Sixth Ecumenical Council, and I give all the evidence that this is an ecumenical council, since that's been disputed. And then Pope Honorius, I think my study is the most in-depth review of the subject perhaps ever done. I mean, I used the internet to just collect every single source I could find about Pope Honorius, both everything that could be said for him and then all that can be said against, and then how Roman Catholics have basically denied that he was a heretic or that he should have been condemned. And basically
you've dedicated from 585 to 710, it looks like, to that question of Honorius.
I mean, it's important because he's so so often talked about. I just wanted to go in and just make a definitive, thorough review. I go into all sorts of. I mean, this took me years to compile. I'm glad the book took so long, because it maybe otherwise I would not have been so thorough in all this. But yeah, I believe it's conclusive. He was a heretic and rightfully condemned. And you could almost argue that Roman Catholics are schismatics in considering him to be part of the church, because they reject the decision of the Sixth Council. And to reject the church's decisions is schism, even if they hold to the true faith.
I've never thought about that. That's actually right. So they hold him as a legitimate pope and not a heretic.
Yeah, a lot of them. I mean, they've been so inconsistent, but I mean, maybe most of the bishops who defined papal infallibility at Vatican I, they didn't believe that Honorius was a heretic. All they thought was maybe he was negligent. And a lot of them just said the records were falsified, that they called it a forgery, his condemnation and his heretical letter. Or they'll interpret it's almost strange, because they'll quote Pope Honorius speaking heresy, and then they'll say it's not heresy because they interpret it differently. But the church fathers of the Sixth Ecumenical Council interpret it as a heretical letter.
So they know better. They know better than the council.
Right. Yeah. I mentioned it too, because I quote Saint Robert Bellarmine, the Roman Catholic saint. He's speaking 1,000 years after the condemnation of Honorius. He's writing in the year 1600, and then the church fathers in the in the 600s, they knew better than we should. I'd rather trust them than someone writing 1,000 years later. So. Next error, these Eucharist only in the form of bread. That's the not giving Christ body and blood under the bread and wine.
This is the second tier in your book. You think of the most important 5. Permitting marriage within prohibited degrees. So with a niece or a sister-in-law, we didn't even cover that. That's permitted.
The Pope, the early church didn't allow marriage with an aunt or nephew, but it's a matter of faith that the Pope can. It's a Council of Trent defined it, and became an issue of the famous divorce of Henry VIII or the Anglican schism, because he tried to argue, oh, I married my sister-in-law, I shouldn't have been able to do that, I should be allowed to get a divorce because this was not valid. Catherine of Aragon, and that's a huge subject, that divorce. But but the early church said it was inappropriate. You cannot marry your sister-in-law or
Of course.
niece or nephew. It's banned in Leviticus. The church said those are still in force today. So, okay, yeah, triple immersion, immaculate conception. We didn't go over that, but I do say, they defined that in the year 1854. So it is a rather new dogma. Before then, you were not allowed to call someone a heretic if they denied the immaculate conception. After that, you have to call someone a heretic. In fact, they had a lot of disputes within Rome on this point, but so that's quite another.
Yeah, we didn't have time for that. We've run out of time. We need to probably go to the questions here because it's already well beyond the time.
Sure, yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah, the forgeries.
The whole last book, which is the number 5 here, is the massive amounts of forgeries and inaccurate historical records. Why don't you just say a word about that, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Sure. Yeah, forgeries. Yeah, that's most of the second book. For some people, that is important. For some, it's not. I mean, I think there are important forgeries that basically deceived Roman Catholics looking into the question, and they misled people even at the time of the Council of Florence and later times. There are serious forgeries trying to promote the filioque, papacy, purgatory, leavened bread. So that's something. They're recognized as forgeries now. But yeah, that's. For more details, you can look into the book.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that. Hopefully this has been very helpful. We do have a big turnout today, even though Father Josiah Trenham, a friend of ours, is on the Tucker Carlson show right now talking about the slaughter, the assassination of Charlie Kirk. But you guys can watch that on review here in a minute. Like, it's going to be all over the internet, so you're not missing anything. We have a new member here. Let me just welcome him, Cesar Gaviria. I don't know if I'm saying your name right. Thank you so much. Good to have you. Rafael Moses Bezeria de Silva. Looks like are you from Brazil? I feel like I've seen your name, maybe not, I don't know. And this is a Roman Catholic Orthodox Christian. That's interesting. Thank you so much for your donation that you're saying that, because actually we could say that. Roman Catholic, that properly would describe the Orthodox Church if we understood the terms proper. Catholic means essentially the whole faith, the whole deposit, preserved, the revelation. It's Katholiki, all of the faith preserved, right? And Roman is not pertaining to the city as much as to the empire. And of course, Constantinople was the new Rome, became the center of the Christian world for 1,000 years. And all of the Christians in the Roman Empire were Romi, and they had what they called Romeosini. And so it's not inappropriate to say you are a Roman Catholic Orthodox Christian, and if we understand the terms properly. But I did not have the ability during this whole presentation to watch the chat and to mark your questions. So if anybody asked any questions, except the one or two that I did see from Calm Fella, and I think that's the only one. If anybody had any questions that they want answered, they need to reissue their question right now. All caps, the word question, all caps, the word question, and submit it in the chat, and I will mark it and we will answer that. But so this is a good time if you have questions about anything with regard to the book, the research, with regard to the difference between Catholicism and Orthodoxy, with regard to anything you'd like to ask, and beyond that as well. If you've got other questions that you want to ask, we always entertain those. We will only do it for about 40 minutes, though, max. I mean, I don't know. Can you endure that, George? What's your schedule like?
40. I could maybe most of the time. Yes, I think I could.
All right, let's try to do 40. We'll see how we go. Let's start with the first question. In the meantime, anybody who wants to ask a question, all caps question in the chat, and we will get to it. First question, I don't know who it's for, if it's for me or you, but we'll see. I recently spoke to a monk about the great Metropolitan Neophytes of Morphu. This is, of course, the bishop in Cyprus. That's a very well-known disciple of several saints. And we're very glad to be distributing his first book in English. She told me, this is I guess a nun, that by being a female, she didn't like him too much. Oh no, she spoke to a monk, she says. Okay, the question is a little off. Maybe she spoke to a monk about them, but anyway, a nun maybe she was. And she told me that being a female, she didn't feel too much for his extremism. How can I respond? I don't think he's extreme at all. I don't know what the extremism is. What does she mean, the extremism? What's the extremism? To be able to answer that, you'd have to know what she means by extremism. What has he done that's extreme? If she thinks that, I don't know, not wanting to shut down the churches during COVID, or not wanting the vax, or not believing, in ecumenism or something is extreme, well, that just shows that she's alienated from the royal path, the current of the saints, because he's straight, square in the middle of Holy Tradition and in the royal path on all those issues that have been controversial over the last 2 years. So the answer is he's not extreme at all. And please define what you mean by extreme, and then maybe she'll understand that she's not defining things as the saints define them, right? Is she referencing the saints and showing how he is not in the royal path in the Holy Tradition? Because that's the criteria for us as Orthodox, right? What have the saints done? What do the saints teach? What's the consensus of the saints? That's our criteria. So if he's following them, teaching what they taught, faithfully passing down what they gave him, he's not extreme, right? There's nothing extreme about it. So that's my response to her. We have a couple questions here. Let me mark them so we don't miss them. And feel free to ask, more questions. We've got time. Let's see. Next question. What are George's qualifications? I assume George is a pseudonym. Okay, George, you're on.
Yeah,
what do you want to talk about?
Right. Yeah, I wrote the book under a pen name. It's I didn't want to put my real full name. I mean my qualifications. I'm not a priest or a scholar. I mentioned that I'm not ordained. So I simply have just put a lot of time into researching these questions, and
You're a researcher.
Yeah. My main focus is computer science. That's my main job, like in software development. So, it's something that's why I tried not to give my opinions a lot. I simply tried to quote the church fathers as much as possible. So to sort of detract as much as possible from anything I have to give my own opinions or thoughts, only to cite others who are more qualified than me. So I considered the work more as a reference work or a compilation of what.
You're not opining here. You're not opining on theology. You're not going on and theologizing speculatively. You're presenting the historical record.
Yeah. So that's basically it. Yeah.
Can you discuss the practice of the papist female altar servers? Is that something you addressed in the book, or is that just something that's so modern that you didn't even address it?
No, I didn't address it. I tend to focus, to appeal the book more to traditionalist Roman Catholics. So, I didn't address that, among other more recent.
I think most people who are traditional would reject it. So, you wouldn't have to convince them that that's a bad idea. That's a very, very recent practice among some Orthodox, I guess. Post-Vatican II, I don't know. Did they? I wonder if they had pre-Vatican II female altar servers. I guess they wouldn't have had. I can't imagine that pre-Vatican II, but
yeah, I tried to almost discuss the controversy as if it was happening before Vatican II, maybe right around the year 1900. So where there was a less sort of, because after, you can really see this, that a lot of these questions that we're talking about just weren't considered important after, let's say, World War I. You can see that really clearly in the rise of ecumenical attitudes. A lot of it is just how, many Anglican priests and Roman Catholic priests and chaplains side by side on the tragic fields of World War I. These sort of things led to a lot more ecumenism afterwards, and the world really changed after
that, the fall of the Russian Empire. So it's just, and now almost these questions are considered. That's why many people don't forgotten about them. They don't think it's important at all. Like, oh, like, why can't we all just be Christian? So, yeah.
Yeah. So if I were to say one or two words about female altar service, it's something that's unfortunately crept into, I think, mainly the Greek archdiocese, maybe the Antiochian archdiocese as well. Some women might say, well, what's the problem with female altars? Well, it doesn't make any sense. The altar, first of all, there's a canon from an ecumenical council that says only ordained are allowed in the altar. All right. So we don't keep that canon strictly because there are many places around the Orthodox world where there are not other ordained except the priest. So the priest needs somebody to serve in the altar, practically speaking. So they either will have somebody ordained a reader or a subdeacon, but until that happens, they'll have somebody just serve with a blessing. So they're essentially getting the blessing of the hierarchy to serve. But the canon says expressly no non-ordained people in the holy altar. So canonically, obviously, ordained people would mean men. There's never been ordained women in the Orthodox Church for 2,000 years for any of the stages of the priesthood. From reader on, there's never been anyone who's been blessed or ordained in the Orthodox Church. And if there's been one or two innovations in the last 30 years, it's seen by the vast majority of Orthodox as an innovation, a departure. And it means that they're in trouble. These people who are innovating, they're not following the Holy Fathers. And this is a terrible spirit that the world is at our door. So the first thing is that canonically it's forbidden. Secondly, it doesn't make any sense because you're here in training for the priesthood, essentially. Like the young men who are being cultivated to serve the church in the altar or to serve carrying the censer or whatever it might be. The whole idea is that this is potentially somebody who would then go on to become a deacon or a subdeacon or a priest. And why would a woman do that when there's so many other things to do in the church? It doesn't make any sense. There's a clear delineation, always has been, between the work of the men and the work of the women. For instance, in the village that I lived in northern Greece, in an old-time village, one of the more traditional in all of Thessaloniki, because it was cut off. It was up in the mountains. And I was a priest there for about 11 years. All the old timers, I'll just give you one example, socially to this day, after church, I would want to gather all of my parishioners together and, do some catechetical instruction or something. They would say, Papa, Father, we have a tradition. We go to the village square and the men over here and the women over there, we drink our coffee. That's the way it is. And they would never sit together. Like women would go over there and sit and drink their coffee. I mean, very rarely they would mix. So there was just an attitude and idea in traditional societies that there's work for men and there's work for women and there's a division. And they were very happy with that. So now with feminism, with destructions of traditional societies, with urbanization, you have these temptations at the door. But they're not organic. They're not coming from within the church. They're a temptation from without. And so there you go. Samuel Thompson, thank you for your question. Samuel, what is the case in favor of the filioque from a middle ground, a pure logic perspective? After all, it may restore God the Son to parity. Restore? What do you mean by that? Is he not on par with God the Father? I'm not sure what that means. Why would a innovation that was not ever taught in the ecumenical councils or is not even in Scripture, right? Scripture, the Lord clearly says, proceeds from the Father. He doesn't say Father and the Son. So why would an innovation not in Scripture, not in the Fathers, not believed and practiced for the first millennium throughout the church and then 2,000 years in the Orthodox Church, why would that be a good idea? First of all. Secondly, I know you're asking from a middle ground logic perspective, but we don't do logic in the Orthodox Church alone. We don't separate it out and speculate and logically try to figure out the Trinity, right? It's revealed to us. And the Lord clearly revealed to us that the Spirit proceeds from the Father. That's his words. So we would never know that. We could never imagine it. and we wouldn't know we still don't know what it means. Like, do you know what procession means exactly? I mean, St. Gregory the theologian mocks the Eunomians because they thought they understood the essence of God, right? So these things are revealed to us, and to a certain degree, and we accept them. So any dogma is not logically figured out or worked out, or the whole speculative theology that became, identified with theology, which is the problem, right? Theology is the one who prays, the one who has divine communion and then revelation and sees face to face. He's the one who has and sees the uncreated light. That's the theologian, not the speculative philosophical approach to theology. That's not even theology. That's speculative philosophical, approach to God. And so that's the question's kind of not the right question. But beyond that, there's nothing that we need to do, God forbid, to bring the Father and the Son to some kind of parity, right? There's nothing missing there. There's no need for that to begin with. I don't know if you want to add anything from your research, George. Feel free.
No, I think your answer was good. Yeah, I didn't look too much into the theological side. I tried to focus more on the history. So that was
right. This is a book which gives the reader the tools to understand the historical, and to a certain degree, because of that, the theological development. But it's not a speculative theological text where we try to argue against the filioque or something. Do Orthodox have any distinction with grave sins and venial sins like Catholics do? Seems weird to say some sins are more acceptable than others. Not as much, not as developed. We don't have that kind of approach, but certainly we could speak about grave sins or deadly sins, which you could say are mortal, right? Deadly mortal sins. They're graver, they're more damaging, they're more impactful in a bad way. And then there are sins that are less damaging, less inflicting of harm. So it's a question of degrees. Of course, they're all missing the mark, right? That's what sin means, to miss the mark. So if I accept in my thoughts a gross fleshly thought, I've missed the mark and I've sinned, even though that's clearly not on the same level as then going and fornicating or becoming a prostitute or an adulterer, obviously. So there's stages and levels of acquiescing and becoming a slave to the sin. And so that's not a problem to make those distinctions. But if you become overly legalistic about it, that's a problem. And I think that's what you're kind of weirded out in the West, because there's an over legalization about it. And the way they deal with it pastorally usually leaves a kind of weird taste in some people's mouths. Anyway, that's just my subjective thought. What about some Orthodox parishes having female handmaids that hold the candles with the altar servers during the gospel? I think that's the same thing. We never had that. It's an innovation. And as I said, with regard to women's ordination or women in the diaconate, it's the so-called in the diaconate, which we never had it, by the way. The diaconissa, the female deacons were never deacons in the same sense as the male deacons, right? Totally different. And it's very clear historically that the diakonissa, that's the Greek phrase for the deaconess, had very specific tasks, and they weren't liturgical. They were to take the Holy Communion to women, to help in the baptism of women, because they were baptized for most of the ancient time naked. And so there were particular roles that they played that had no liturgical or certainly priestly sense to them. So the church has not ever embraced this, and it's never going to do it. And you can say, well, Father, why are you so sure they're never going to do it? Or why are you so dogged about it? Because that's how we roll, if you want to use a contemporary expression, right? That's how we are as Orthodox. We follow the Holy Fathers. If they didn't do it, if our fathers didn't do it, and their fathers and their fathers and their fathers for 2,000 years, going back to the apostles, never did something so vital as to mess with the priesthood, we're not going to do it. It doesn't matter what you think or I think or how good it sounds or what logical explanation is going to be given, because then it's not following the Holy Fathers. And you've got to follow those before you not just the ones that, oh, I liked what Father Saint so-and-so said in the 8th century. No. That's irrelevant. Who are your fathers, the saints of our day? That's who we follow in time and space, real time and space. I have spiritual fathers. Now they're following the saints before them. Everyone in the Orthodox Church has to follow the saints, not just the laymen or the monks. Everyone, bishops, patriarchs, old ladies, young women, all follow the saints. That's how we all stay on the narrow path and we become saints. So did the saints ever teach us to do this? No. Where did this come from? It's a laxity with the world. It's a not paying attention. It's not struggling to follow faithfully what's been handed down to us. We never had altar servers who were not men. We're not going to start now. It's not something that we're going to do. There's no reason to do that, right? There's plenty to do in the church. Everybody has their roles. It's the same. Now, it's a very small example, but if you want to go to the extreme example of the insanity of the world, it's functionally not much different than people saying, well, why can't men give birth? Or why can't women fight in the military? And well, because they're not made to do that. It's like God didn't make them to do that. We never did that. We don't send our women off to die for us in the Orthodox world, right? That doesn't happen. So all this is a innovation. And if we're wise, we will stay clear of it because we don't have the blessings of our fathers on these things. So I think that's the answer to whatever, even if it seems to you small, insignificant, wouldn't it be nice? Wouldn't it be great, if we could just do X, Y, Z? We don't do that in the Orthodox Church. We just, I think we'll just change this. We'll add that. The wise man doesn't do that. He said, what did they hand it down to us? That's why the mission field is a wonderful place and a dangerous place. America is a dangerous place. Why? Because if we don't have examples, monasteries, elders, saints in our midst, innovation creeps in. Heresy is at the door. Secularization is close to us. We have to have the examples, the living examples. That's what keeps us on the narrow path. All right, now I'm off topic and enough of my ranting. Next question is here. I've been learning a lot of prayers in Latin. What is the Orthodox view on the possibility of the Western Rite using Latin as the primary language, epistle and gospel in vernacular? George, do you have any thoughts on that? I'll answer after you.
On the possibility of Western Rite using Latin. Oh yeah, I don't think there's any issue with the Latin language. I know in the book I mentioned there are some issues I bring up that some Western Rite Orthodox are doing that are second millennium innovations or rather late innovations, but so that might be one deviation. But no, I mean although the idea of the language is it's understood by the vernacular by the people, so but. As far as I know, I think they only speak Latin in the Vatican right now. But
yeah, I don't think there's any. I mean, from my perspective, there's absolutely no reason why we couldn't use Latin in the liturgy to chant or anything like that. Well, of course not. We never had a sacred language like the Roman Catholics or the Latins did. Right? We didn't do that. We fought it actually in our mission field in Bavaria or in Moravia and in yeah.
I had a chapter on that, actually, the use of the vernacular. I know Protestants brought that up early on, and there was even discussion in the 1700s if English would be allowed in America for Roman Catholics, but it was only allowed by Vatican II. And then, I talk about how at one point they allowed the Slavonic language in the liturgy from the Roman Catholics, but then a later pope prohibited that after the schism. So another inconsistency.
Yes. Next question. What should I do with my Jerusalem cross from before I was Orthodox? Can I wear it? Should I sell it? Should I get rid of it? Is it offensive to the Orthodox Church? As far as I know, any cross. I mean, I know there's, obviously it's connected with the Crusaders, and some of the Crusaders didn't do well. The poor guys, they went a little off, and we don't have a good memories. But a cross is I don't see any reason why you couldn't wear a cross. Is there something about the Jerusalem cross that I don't know? And you know anything about it, George?
I'm not. Yeah, I don't know too much about that. So I don't know the answer to that.
I don't know what the what the hang up is. I mean, yes, I guess it's kind of now viewed as Latin or Roman Catholic, but it, can a cross ever really be stolen from us or something? I
I
don't
guess I
know.
would look into the historical use in like Orthodox churches. Yeah, try and find precedent for
Yeah,
that.
I mean, I
Maybe
would go to
might
your
have a-
spiritual father. Go to your spiritual father and do whatever he says. But theoretically, I don't know if there's an obvious yes or no, or no rather. I mean, just absolutely no. I'm from Brazil, and in here there are a lot of Roman Catholics. Every time I say I am Orthodox, they get confused and ask, "What is it?" How do you explain them the Orthodox Church? Go ahead, George, and I'll go after you.
Yeah. Oh, can I see that question up there?
You
Or
bet. You bet.
okay, yeah.
I read
I hear
fast. Yeah.
there's a lot of Roman Catholics. I'm confused. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good. I mean, it's a very broad, general question. Yeah, we could say. I mean, I've not been to Brazil, but yeah, just the Orthodox Church. You could talk about in terms of the contrast, saying it's not the Pope who is in charge, but we have the bishops and patriarchs, and I mean, you can talk about the theological differences. Although to a general person asking, the filioque might not mean much to them. But you could talk about how the Orthodox Church is the one true church because it follows the historic paths. We could say we in a way, we are the Catholic Church because times change, conditions change, but truth never changes. God's always the same, and yeah. So
Mhm.
yeah,
I would say if you're with somebody who's open minded and they're malleable, you could be a little bold and say, well, because before the Pope became a Protestant, he was Orthodox.
yeah, we could say the Orthodox Church is founded on the Holy Bible and tradition, and the tradition is every religious truth that was passed down from generation to generation, and it's been handed down to us. So it's not like we could say the Roman Catholics are those who have added many things, prepared new dogma, and you might say today you accept such and such a doctrine, but you never know what the Pope might prepare. He has authority to prepare new dogma, which you have to accept tomorrow.
Yes,
And
he is the first Protestant from the Orthodox perspective, and so you want to get them to think outside the box. But that's only if somebody has a good disposition. If they don't and they're totally clueless, just talk about the ancient church. We're the ancient church. We're the church that never, that hasn't innovated, that hasn't changed. And get them thinking, oh, I need to learn about this church. I need to figure out that you can't be ignorant of history and become an Orthodox Christian. At least you got to know something. I mean, it's really hard to be a Christian. And one of the great, even though I don't like his writings very much, there's a French Guénon, René Guénon, and one of his greatest criticism of Protestantism is you can't be a Christian and be anti-traditional. It's not possible because tradition has been the conduit and the forea, the conveyor of the life of the church. That's holy tradition, right? That's God passing from generation to generation. And so that immediately means you got to know where you came from. You got to know your roots. You got to know your history. And so these people, these rootless people of the 20th century, if they don't have some sense of history, that's one of the reasons why the Western world has been so hampered in becoming Orthodox, is because we don't get taught history. None of us in America got taught about the Roman Empire in the East and the Constantinople or anything like that. I mean, very rare. So how do you even get a sense of the church? And look, God is the God of history. God guides history, and he's left his fingerprints all over history. If you want to know him, you've got to know history. You've got to know and love history to a certain degree, right? Because he came and he became a man in time and space. He came into history, our history. And so I think that's really important that you're pointing people to think out of the box and know a little history. And so the ancient church, talk about how we're the ancient church, the church that has come from the very beginning and has not changed. That's what I would say. David Sidmorang of the Most Holy Sacrament. I have watched Western Rite Ortho explain the Sacred Heart, and of course they say the devotion is valid. It's just like the veneration of the Archiopieto icon of Jesus' head. What do you think about it? I'll let George start.
yeah, I'm not familiar with that icon.
You know what that is? That's the mandolin, the holy mandolin.
Oh,
icon.
yes.
It's
Okay.
imprint
I just
of
looked
the
it up.
face.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Okay. Repeat. Okay. Yeah. And there are some differences. I'm not trying to say every single item is an error, but that there's just this tendency to innovation in the Latin uh, side of things. So, I mean, I welcome, you know, feedback and criticism. It's not something I looked into very thoroughly. I just saw that I saw the Catholic Encyclopedia make these admissions, and this is something that I read some Orthodox people saying this is has tendency to heresy or Nestorianism, perhaps. I don't think the icon. I mean, the idea is that it's worship or veneration directed to a specific physical body part. Just having the head of Christ. I don't think there's a veneration just for, let's say, the physical head of Christ. I don't think that's what the intention of the icon is. As for the Western Rite, yeah, I know they do keep some traditions from the Latin side, but
Look, George, there's a robust rejection of the veneration of the Sacred Heart of Mary and Jesus in among those who've written on it in the Orthodox Church, and it does pose theological problems. So, you know, I don't see any. What are they pointing to by saying it's like the veneration of the Mandilion or the made without hands image of Christ? I don't see any correlation, because first of all, that was a miraculous icon made, and we're not venerating his face alone. It's not like some kind of we're contemplating and we're separating his face from his body. It was a miraculous. Secondly, it's likely, although there's no proof of this, it's likely the shroud. I mean, there's a case to be made that it could be the shroud, or at least one of the historical witnesses in Constantinople when the emperor came back and he had brought it back from Edessa, from the Persians. They describe what he's bringing, and some people say this is actually the shroud, which we call the Shroud of Turin today. Some people think it's the same shroud. But in any case, there's witnesses in Constantinople where this is the burial cloth of the Lord, and they've folded it, and you're seeing the face only. Now, that's just speculation. I don't know, but there's witnesses historically to this event. So again, not in the least some kind of separation of the organ or the part of Christ out for particular veneration, which is what's happening with the Sacred Heart, at least intellectually. Why the filioque phrase is such a big problem, considering the Catholic faith? Is that what you want to write here? Catholic faith. Understand that the phrase is used to define the Holy Spirit.
Proceed. I think
maybe proceed is what I say, from the Father through the Son. Isn't St. Basil already talking about this? Yeah. So you're getting into the theological question of filioque, which would be a great live stream in and of itself. But my short answer is that you would need to come to terms with the tremendous patristic refutations of the filioque. Familiarize yourself with the theological writings of Saint Photius the Great and his Mystagogy, Saint Gregory Palamas and his On the Procession of the Holy Spirit, which we published, by the way, you can get from Uncut Mountain Press, translated with Greek and English, both there. If you know Greek, then you can check against the English. And you can see that these treatises and the whole Orthodox response to filioque sees it as a distortion, perversion, heresy, outright heresy with regard to the persons of the Holy Trinity, the proper understanding of the persons of the Holy Trinity, that this theology leads to a subjugation and of the place and person of the Holy Spirit. It's not following the theology of the Cappadocians, which is really the theology of the councils, and on and on and on. There's tons of material online that you can read more and understand. But you've got to understand, one of the problems we have with this whole discussion is that the Western-minded pro-filioque crowd does not is not interested and does not do due diligence to understand within the patristic tradition and in, if you want, from their perspective, the East, these treatises. They want to approach them on their own basis, and they're never going to understand them if they do that. And that goes for orthodoxy in general. If you're coming in with a legalistic, very, understand it and accept it, but legalistic and Western mentality, and now you're going to try to figure out orthodoxy, you're dead on arrival. You've got to understand it in its own context, own terms. And it requires a little bit of humility and patience and experience. And I mean experience, going to church. Or at least being open to talking to Orthodox people and listening. That's how you're going to be able to come to understand it properly in its proper context. So, in 2 minutes, we're not going to do justice to the Filioque. But thank you for your question. And I hope you find time to read those treatises and understand the fathers. Is there anything in the books about Marian apparitions? That's George. That's you.
Yeah, I didn't talk about those. That's not. I know that's a big subject, but I simply have not researched it too much. So
it's not an issue that you dealt with before the 19th century, right? This is all pretty 20th century, or was there a robust?
There are some. I know there were some in the 1800s, but I'm trying to think about. There have been different apparitions in history, but I don't know. I remember being a bit hesitant to criticize that because there have been many Orthodox saints who've had, of course, interactions with.
Yeah, it's a lot more murky. It's not clear. It's not clear. There's all kinds of different, accounts and all kinds of things. But yeah, it's a different issue. It's a different animal entirely than what you're dealing. I went to an Orthodox church for the first time, and it just felt right. What are the next steps? Go back and just go, several more times, I would say. Talk to the priest. Consider what it means to become a catechumen. Think about it. Pray about it. Discuss it with your mother, father, brother, sister, wife, whatever. Talk to the priest again. But, going to the Orthodox Church, it's not something you just do. It's something you do with a thought of becoming an Orthodox Christian. In the ancient church, non-Orthodox, non-Christians, before the 5th century probably, would not be able to stay for the Divine Liturgy, and the catechumens departed, and probably the non-Orthodox either departed the catechumens or even before. It depends on what their stance was. But so the second half of the Divine Liturgy really not meant for non-Orthodox. It doesn't make any sense. If you look at it's called the Liturgy of the Faithful. So I just want to drive home that you're going to an Orthodox church not as a, let's take a tour or something, but it's intentional. And so I think the next steps are, what am I doing here? And am I looking at Orthodoxy? Now, it might take weeks or months, but you work that out with the priest, and you discern, if you're not just, is it the true church? Of course, you'll come to that hopefully, but am I ready to become an Orthodox Christian? And I want to be a catechumen. I want to live this life, right? That's important on your part. So that's the next step, is to kind of spend time thinking, praying about that, talking to your priest. First of all, thank you for the answer, Father. And what should I say if I hear them saying that Jesus gave Peter the keys to Rome, so Rome and the Vatican is the right door, or something like that? Well, there's tons of answers out there, but one of the answers is that he gave keys to Peter. That's true. First of all, what are the keys? Define the keys. And then what did they do he gave keys to the others? Because the keys are the apostolic power, authority to bind and loose. Right? That's the heart of the keys. That's what it means. And every bishop has that. So the whole misinterpretation on the papist side, which is very late, by the way, is that somehow that's only for one bishop in the church, not for the others who have this successors of the apostles, not for the others who were successors of Peter, because Peter was also in Antioch. Why can't Antioch claim what they're claiming? There's no good reason they can't. So, and then to say, well, Peter, according to St. Cyprian and others, is not just a type or the forerunner of the Bishop of Rome, but he's the type of every bishop. Peter is a type of every bishop. So every bishop in this deeper sense is Peter. And that's a patristic stance. So there's grave and gross ignorance. What there is a kind of ideological talking points, quote mining. That's what you find among the Latin Roman Catholic defenders, and not a serious grappling with the patristic mind on these deeper questions of identity, boundaries, and roles, which, really you have to understand if you're going to understand then the question of the papacy within the church. You want to add anything to that, George?
Well, I do have to step away.
Okay, George, no worries. It has been 40 minutes. We've only got 2 more questions. Let me just blow through those, George, and then we'll let you go quick. 2 minutes.
Briefly, I'd recommend Denny's Papalism, just for there's a lot of good quotes about the Father's interpretation of Peter.
What's the name of the book?
Papalism by Edward Denny. That has some good...
Edward Denny. There you go. Okay. Last 2 questions real quick, and then we're out. Father, the nun I was talking to was referring to his lack of forgiveness towards the heterodox. Of course, I disagree, but I don't know how to respond. Some fathers are just more harsh. I don't see it. I know him well. I've been there 3 or 4 times. He's talking about Metropolitan Neophytos. He's a beautiful, wonderful soul. You don't want to leave his presence when you're there. There's no lack of forgiveness in his part by any stretch. Now, he might be pedagogically harsh, but that's maybe what some of us need. We're all snowflakes today. Do you think most of the RC clergy and laity are generally ignorant and actually believe that they are in the church? Or deep down, do they know the truth? That's for you. Quick, George, and I'll answer.
I'm not too sure. I mean, part of it is just about the sincerity of the... I don't like to doubt anyone's sincerity of faith. So I try not to do that. I always assume good faith. I mean, maybe, and even ignorance is, perhaps ignorance, or just not, like, at a certain point, they just don't think certain things are that important, although just, they...
It's not one thing. There's probably a whole variety of understandings, levels of understandings. There's probably the whole spectrum of people who are very, very sincere, think they're in the true church, think it's all good, and then those who are sinister, that they don't care. I mean, that's just human nature, right? So there's a whole spectrum that happens in the Orthodox Church. There are sinister, worldly people who play a role and they're not faithful. That's not here nor there. So it's kind of a theoretical question. Doesn't really matter at the end of the day. Everybody's going to give an account for themselves. All right, so there are a couple more questions, but next time around, Constantine and others, thank you so much for joining us, George. Hopefully this is going to be very, very helpful. First of all, to all of our listeners, to all of those who are searching, to all of the Roman Catholics out there who are interested in Orthodoxy, and then for those who wanted to know more about this book and now they can decide if they want to go and purchase it. We're very grateful to you, George, for the many years of service to the church in producing this text, and hopefully it'll help many souls, and then your soul as well, because of others becoming closer to Christ. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Father Peter.
All right, guys, we'll see you on Thursday, next live stream, The Mystery of Christ, this coming Thursday. Good night.
Why did the bishops in Chalcedon feel they needed to judge Theodoret if Leo had already reinstated him?
well, they didn't recognize Roman jurisdiction in the eastern provinces. So Leo's reinstating for them was not decisive. A decision has to be made in the east. Theodoret's position at the council is a very interesting one. When the